Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel for Monistic Idealism. I'm joined by two very awesome guests. I have Bernardo Kastrup and Kyle Friesen. How's it going, guys?
I'm doing fine. Yourself?
Hey, doing great. So, Bernardo, we've had on the show before. I'll give a quick, brief introduction. He's the leading idealist academic right now. He's great. He's been on the show before. He has published many books, many articles that you can check out. The Idea of the World is one that's well known. Science Ideated was one that was done recently. But he's also involved with the Essentia Foundation. I believe he's in charge of it or one of the leaders. So check all of that stuff out. And then we have Kyle as well, who's a friend of mine, and he's an idealist, young academic, a Chad. He's here, he's going to ask some great questions for Bernardo. A lot of stuff that's a lot of objections that's brought up against idealism often, usually in like chats and things like that, and some other more advanced stuff, but other general questions as well. So we're very, very grateful for Bernardo to come here and answer some questions. And yeah, I'll just let you guys go ahead and do this.
Okay, hello everyone. So, Emma did a great introduction for us. We're just going to jump right in for some philosophical conundrums for Bernardo. The first one that comes up a lot is something called the locked in. It's a rebuttal of the outside world being different stuff than we experience. This is the idea that we, starting from our points of view, are making incorrect inferences of the world through the eyes and nervous systems as biological organisms. And as such, organisms are making an error in positing the outside world is made of consciousness experience, simply because we can't get behind that. Those experiences are due to our viewpoint, our biology.
So the error is that I didn't understand what the error is. What is the erroneous inference that we make?
So usually the materialists will say that, of course, we're making an inference that, through our nervous systems, we're getting experience somehow. The outside world's made of non-experiential stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But because we have that perspective, we can't infer anything else outside of that, right? But it is different. And we're making a category error somewhere because that outside world is made of matter. The idealist is just saying, okay, we're locked in this view. Basically, they're positing something different. They're positing matter outside of experience. We're just saying it's experience, but they're saying that the stuff outside is matter. And we're making that error because that's what a nervous system does. That's what it feels like, but it's different stuff.
Yeah, okay, I
So,
understand.
and yeah.
It is undeniable that there is an external world beyond our individual minds, beyond the boundaries of our personal mentation. That's undeniable. If I am dreaming and I become lucid during my dream, I can influence the dream. I can change the world of the dream merely by an act of volition. If I am having a daydream or a fantasy, I can influence that fantasy by a direct act of volition. But I can't change the world by a direct act of volition. So there is something outside the sphere of my personal mentation and the sphere of your personal mentation. There is something outside individual minds, which individual minds inhabit. It's very difficult, if at all coherent, to get away from this conclusion. So I embrace this. The error is the following. In admitting that there is a world outside individual minds, we take one step further and we say, and that world is outside mind in general. In other words, it's categorically different from mentation. It's a different kind of stuff. It's not mind stuff. It's abstract physical stuff that is exhaustively describable through quantities alone and has no intrinsic qualitative dimension to it, even though the world in perception is a purely qualitative world. It's colors, melodies, flavors, scents, and so on, textures. So that second step is unjustified because that there are mental processes outside my individual mind and your individual mind is empirically clear. My thoughts are mental, but they are outside your mind. You cannot change my thoughts merely by a direct act of volition. And my thoughts would still be here, even if you were not around. So from your point of view, my thoughts are objective and they are external, and you can't change them by wishing them to be different. But my thoughts are still mental, and they are still qualitative, not quantitative. So what an objective idealism would say is the following. Evidence that there is a world outside individual minds is obvious, but we need extra motivation to take that next step and say, and it's different from mind itself. Because on the face of it, since there is mind stuff outside my individual mind, then the world might as well be made of mind stuff that is outside my individual mind, and which presents itself to me as what I call colloquially the physical world. So from that perspective, the colloquially physical does not need to be strictly physical in the sense that it is exhaustively describable through quantities alone. The colloquially physical can be intrinsically qualitative, not made of the qualities of my perception, but intrinsically qualitative. And we actually have evidence that this is exactly what so-called matter is, because my being, which I can experience directly through introspection, is mental. I am a bundle of mental processes, my thoughts, my emotions, my memories, my mental dispositions, my fantasies, and so on and so forth. But when I look in the mirror, I see a physical entity. So in principle, my mental processes present themselves to external observation in the form of what we call matter or physical stuff, my body, my brain activity. So it seems like my mental inner life looks like physical stuff when observed from the outside by another person or by intermediation of a mirror. And since my body is made of the same atoms and force fields as the rest of the universe, unless you want to postulate an arbitrary boundary or an arbitrary discontinuity in nature, we have, in principle, good reason to think that this is what matter always is, not only in the case of our bodies, matter being what our minds look like from the outside, but for the rest of the universe as well. And that would account for an external world that is mental just like we are, and yet outside individual minds, a world which we inhabit and which presents itself to observation in the form that we call colloquially the physical universe. Does it address the question you asked?
I think it does, because the whole issue comes from, so the idealist takes the view that there's just mind stuff, and we just infer, like you said, there's more earth beyond the curve of the earth, right? The materialist says, well, it's all matter, but because we start from this view, like an epistemological idealism, right? How do we get to an ontological one? Well, that's like a leap of faith, because it's matter. And of course, we'll get to that inference because we start from this perspective, but it's matter.
Oh, yeah, I understand it.
Yeah,
But
I think you had that during
the premise of the feeling or the argument that you just expressed is that there is a sense in which materialism or physicalism, I will use the words interchangeably, is the simpler and more direct option, and that the idealist justifies a less simple, less direct option based on an epistemic stand. Like, all I know is mind, therefore there is only mind, while the materialist says, well, that's an epistemic limitation, but there might as well be a non-mind. Well, the possibility is clear. There is no logical incoherence in postulating the non-mental. It is not logically incoherent to say there is a world that is different from mind. But it's not the simpler approach. It's not the default approach. It's not, why would it be preferred? Because the materialist is in fact making one extra postulate. There is one extra thing that the materialist requires, which is a ontological category that is non-mental, although all we know is the mental. So from a parsimoniousness point of view, parsimony point of view, the preferred option is to account for the external world in terms of the ontological category that is a given, that is a pre-theoretical given, which is mind stuff. if we can make do with that, then that obviously should be preferred from the point of view of parsimony and conceptual parsimony, Occam's razor. But the materialist wants to go a step further. He wants to postulate one extra thing that is a pure theoretical abstraction, which I would argue is not necessary. And that's a second point, it creates an insoluble problem. Because now you have to recover mind from a theoretical abstraction of mind, like a dog chasing its own tail. And that leads to the hard problem of consciousness. So there are two reasons why the materialist approach is not the default. It's not the simplest. On the contrary, it's less simple. It's more, it's unnecessary, and it leads to an insoluble problem. Why would you prefer that? It makes absolutely no sense. The only reason people have this intuition that materialism should be simpler is cultural momentum. They are used to this culturally prevalent notion that materialism should be the case, but this is pure subjectivity. There is no logic or empirical foundation for this.
I was going to save this question for later, but this ties in well. It's the new Mysterian position and the expansion of definitions. This one feeds in well, but so this problem occurs as a result of the difficulties arising from the hard problem of consciousness and physicalists not finding a suitable answer. So all positions like emergence, illusionism, etc., have been tossed aside as they have problems. Yet the new Mysterian will conclude that although they cannot figure out what consciousness is, that it must be physical. It then follows that all positions are free to posit whatever position they like, idealism, panpsychism, etc., as valid because they are as valid, not because they are true, but because it will forever be a mystery. But it must be physical. So we believe other non-physical views in vain. Idealism is doomed to fail. I was like, okay, what?
This is so silly. It's I know this is not coming from you. I mean, you're collecting the arguments that can be made, or people think that this is an argument. It's not an argument at all. Look, I cannot logically refute materialism. Does this mean much? No, it doesn't mean much at all. I cannot logically refute the flying spaghetti monster. I cannot logically refute the possibility that there is a 19th century teapot in the orbit of Saturn. There are a great many nonsensical things, probably an infinite amount of it, that I cannot logically refute. It's logically coherent, even physically coherent. The teapot in the orbit of Saturn is physically coherent. The flying spaghetti monster is also physically coherent. There may be a noodly monster in a hyperdimension that I cannot see, moving the planets around their orbits through gravity that crosses dimensions by moving its noodly appendages. It's physically coherent. It's logically coherent. Why don't we take it seriously? Because it's not all about physical or logical coherence. It's also about explanatory power. It's about internal consistency. It's about conceptual parsimony. These three things are the criteria on the basis of which we can discard an infinite tsunami of nonsense. If you part with these three, you part with reason. It's all up for grabs. Then where do you stop once you open that gate? So if you don't want to open that gate, and you better not, and you want to apply conceptual parsimony, internal consistency, I said another one, never mind. Then on that basis, you have to not take physicalism seriously, because it's not conceptually parsimonious. It proposes more concepts than we need by saying that the world is mental, although it's out there, it's outside. It's internally inconsistent because it defines matter as that which has nothing to do with mind. In other words, matter is fully and exhaustively describable in purely quantitative terms, while mind is eminently qualitative. So you define matter as that which has nothing to do with mind, and then you try to recover mind from it, having defined it as that which has nothing to do with mind. That's the hard problem. And it's an internal inconsistency of materialism. It's also, to put the same thing in different terms, because we are cooped up in mental stuff. It's the sole pre-theoretical given of nature. Matter is a theoretical abstraction. It's an abstraction of mind. And the mind that abstracts matter into existence then tries to explain itself in terms of its own abstraction, which is, of course, the dog chasing its own tail. For matter to have meaning, it needs a mind to abstract it. But if that mind tries to reduce itself to matter, then that mind has to pre-exist matter, and therefore matter cannot exist because its meaning is grounded in a mental abstraction. So, and it, in terms of explanatory power, materialism cannot make sense of experience, which is all we have. Everything else is theoretical abstraction of materialism. So there is a sense in which materialism explains precisely nothing, because everything is, or is at least intermediated by, mentation. So it fails on those three other criteria that we cannot part with. Otherwise, we have to embrace the flying spaghetti monster, an alien from the Pleiades influencing our heart vibrations and whatever else nonsense is out there. So,
well, some. This is just quick, but some do. They'll be like, absurdism. None of this makes sense. It's all just blah.
Well, this is a desperate move by people who have realized they took a position that is untenable to avoid admitting defeat. And the move is the following. Well, darn, it turns out that I am wrong, but at least I'll make sure that everybody else is also seen as wrong.
Sinking ship, yeah.
Yeah, because then I don't lose. If everybody sinks in the same ship. Now, that's, if you pardon my French, this is bullshit. It's a pile of stinky, humid, fetid bullshit. Because the fact that some people made a wrong move doesn't mean that everybody else made a wrong move as well. The fact that materialism fails doesn't mean that everything else fails as well. When there is a very, very good case to be made about at least one other family of alternatives. So I think this is a desperate move by people who are insecure enough that they don't want to lose. Sorry for my...
No, that was great. No, I agree. I think that's a good one.
I think this actually be a good time just to bring in something that's hugely requested by tons of your readers. It's the G. Moore refutation of idealism. Emma, did you want to chime in on that?
Can you say it again? Moores.
Yeah,
Moores.
yeah.
Okay, yeah, okay.
Russell and Moore, yeah, Moore.
Yeah. A lot of people were just wondering to see if you had, because I guess sometimes this is just thrown around a lot. They say, yeah, Russell and Moore already refuted idealism. They just sort of cite that paper, the refutation of idealism. They just sort of wield this around like it's a club to beat over people's heads and be like, see, idealism's been refuted already. Don't you know about the history of analytic philosophy? So, what would you say? Do you have a response to Russell and Moore?
That's the epistemic refutation, right? The fact that something cannot be accessed epistemically doesn't mean that it cannot exist.
There was, I can't recall. I know Kyle has some notes written on it. I know one of them that I remember is he tried to say that all forms of idealism rest on this idea that to be is to be perceived, and they also misunderstood monism in a way. I don't want to go on too long, but they basically thought monism must insist that only one thing exists. Okay, when actually most monists, like those like Schaffer, would say that, well, one thing is fundamental, and even though there's many things like tables and chairs and you and me, there's just one thing is fundamental, like the fundamental subject that we all dissociate from. So we're not necessarily saying that only one thing exists per se, unless you are, of course. But so they misunderstood monism, and they misunderstood what we mean by idealism, I guess, in a sense.
Yeah.
They think we all are committed to the idea that to be is to be perceived. So, Kyle, is there anything else, real quick? Kyle, is there anything else on the objections that they gave that you to provide the full question?
Yeah, you mentioned quickly, like they mentioned a Berkeleyan kind of subjectivism, and then the subject object split. but I think that was addressed well in a 1978 refutation of their argument by Allenson. So I guess it's just subject object, to be perceived, and what was the first one? What was the first one?
I can comment around
Yeah,
that.
yeah, sure.
So I'll comment on two possible criticisms. I don't quite remember which one was Russell's and Moore's, but one was the following. The idealist claims that because all we know is mind, then everything must be mind. That's not the idealist claim, huh? But I will explain that soon. But if this is the claim, then we can refute it, because the fact that we are cooped up in mind does not logically imply that there isn't anything non-mental. In other words, the fact that we can only access mind and become acquainted with mind does not mean that there is nothing that is non-mental. There isn't this implication. The limitations of our knowledge do not translate to ontological limitations in reality. That's correct. But the original argument that is refuted is also not the idealist argument. You have never heard me say, because all we know is mind, then there must only be mind. No,
Right.
no. The argument is, since all we know is mind, only mind is given. Therefore, do we have reasons to postulate the non-mental? And then I take it from there. And then I talk about the lack of explanatory power of materialism. Then I talk about the empirical refutations of materialism in Foundations of Physics and the Neuroscience of Consciousness. Then I talk about the internal inconsistencies of materialism, parsimony problems. So the argument is not that, since all I know is mind, then there is only mind. No, this is a silly argument. And it's correctly refuted by saying the fact that all we know is mind doesn't mean that there is only mind. Yes, that's a good refutation, but against an argument that's not the argument for idealism. Now, the other possibility, and that's Berkeleyan subjective idealism, the notion that to be is to be perceived. That's a problematic notion, which Berkeley tried to resolve in the following way. If to be is to be perceived, then who is holding the state of the world when nobody is looking? Does the tree fall in the forest if there is nobody there to hear? And this is a problem because, you see, when I come back home in the evening, I park my car in my garage, I close my garage and I come up, and for the next 12 hours, nobody sees or hears my car. But when I come down next morning, I open the door and lo and behold, there is the car. Who held the state of the world, entailing that the car is in my garage while nobody was perceiving it? That's a problem for Berkeleyan subjective idealism. And Berkeley replied it by saying, well, God perceives the car. So you need God to perceive things. He gave two answers. What I just said is one of them. The problem is the following. Berkeley visualized idealism as a sort of a mental broadcast to a number of individual minds, as if a movie was being broadcast to your head. There is no world around you. It's all an internal broadcast. So the world exists only insofar as the qualities of your or somebody else's perception. And this is a problem because it essentially denies an external world. And you try to replace an external world by a sort of internal broadcast system in which God is the great perceiver, and he broadcasts those perceptions adjusted for perspective and spatiotemporal location to other perceivers. And it is incredibly inelegant. And and despite that, it has been pursued until very recently. There have been people working on this until 2018 at least. I haven't followed after that. But it requires there to be a sort of cosmic database of all possible qualities of perception under any angle, any perspective, and any spatial temporal locus that is then broadcast just right for an observer to create the illusion of an actual external world. That's a problem, and I don't endorse it. And this is not what analytic idealism or any other form of objective idealism entails. modern idealism is not Berkeleyan idealism. Modern idealism says the following: there is a world that would be there even if nobody were perceiving it. To be is not to be perceived. To be is to be mental. To be is to be experienced, not perceived. So the qualities of perception are a measurement of mental qualities out there. There are mental processes in nature at large, mind at large. They do not have the qualities of perception. They have a first-person perspective. There is something it is like to be the physical universe outside living beings. And those mental processes present themselves to living beings in the form of the qualities of perception. But if nobody were perceiving it, there would be no qualities of perception, but the thing perceived would still be there. And it would still be mental, although not perceptual. What objective idealism says is that there are endogenous mental states underlying the inanimate universe, not perceptual, endogenous. And when we look and interact with those endogenous mental states out there, when we measure them, then we create the qualities of our perception as a kind of dashboard representation of the mental environment in which we are immersed. So the moon as a quality of perception, that silvery, shiny disk up in the sky, exists only if somebody is perceiving it, because those qualities of perception depend on there being perception. But the thing represented in our cognition as the shiny disk up in the night sky, that thing is there, regardless of whether anybody is perceiving it or not. It's holding the state of nature. But from its own first-person perspective, that thing does not feel like a silvery, shiny disk up in the sky. We don't know what it is like to be the thing represented as the moon in perception. To know that, you need to be it. But we are not it, so we do not know. All we know is how we cognitively represent it. And that's a quality of perception. So even if tomorrow all living beings died, evaporated from nature in one go, the rest of the universe would still exist. But it wouldn't be physical in the sense that physicality, colloquially speaking, is defined by the qualities of perception. So for there to be physicality, something has to be doing the perceiving in order for those qualities to arise. But the thing perceived is not made of the qualities of perception. The qualities of perception are an inner cognitive representation of the thing out there. To be is not to be perceived in modern idealism.
Excellent answer. And I just want to say, thank you for clearing that up, because there's a quote I'm going to read real quick by F.H. Bradley, because he was around when those like Russell and Moore, when these objections were going around, and he just didn't have the patience for it. And he says as much in this quote. It's so ridiculous. I mean, he's an absolute idealist, and of course he's not a Berkeleyan. And so for him to just not even have the balls to address these sort of absolute idealists and such is just like, well, cowardly move for Russell and Moore. And so I just want to read this quote real quick. It's only a few sentences. This is by F.H. Bradley. It's a letter that's being written to G.F. Stout. Moore on idealism was to me very disappointing. The article in the main depended on certain theses held by Moore, but not stated by him, at least clearly. But no one but an incompetent person would hold idealism true if he did not deny these theses. Moore ought to have seen that, but probably would not find it convenient to affirm them. And if they are true, idealism is not, as he says, merely improved, but demonstrably false, as indeed is pretty nearly everything. I thought of briefly pointing out what Moore assumes and suggesting that he should discuss that, and that anything else was a mere waste of time. But I have not energy for controversies. I'm afraid that Moore, with all his cleverness, will not do much unless he will use his dialectical abilities on both sides of the case. I can't imagine why he does not. I read some of his book on ethics. I didn't care for it, and the criticisms of utilitarianism and Sidgwick surely was all or most of it old stuff that should never have been offered as new. But moral philosophy tends to nauseate me, Excuse me this rigmarole. I hope that you and Mrs. Stout are both well. Yours truly, F.H. Bradley. I just thought that was great.
Yeah, in philosophy, we call this kind of argument the straw man argument, right? First, you misrepresent the opposition and creating the straw man, and then you burn it. You refute your own misinterpretation of the argument of the opposition, and that's what they did.
Yep.
There's a lot of history here. You know, in the first half of the 19th century, German idealism dominated the Western world. To the point that it unified science and the church. Protestant churches across Europe embraced Hegelian absolute idealism in the first half of the 19th century. In Denmark, the Reformed Church was overtly Hegelian, very overtly. But then in the second half of the 19th century, something happened, and a consistent misportrayal of idealism led to its seeming refutation, because it was easy to burn that straw man. And in the early 20th century, when analytic philosophy was born from Russell, Wittgenstein, and others, and that move to logical positivism took place, that was a sort of a takeover of, you know, the general ethos of the Western mind that moved from the ethos of German idealism to the ethos of the Anglo-Saxon analytic empirical approach. And a lot of stuff happened in those times that were not really guided by logic and reason. There were political and social psychological motivations for a lot that happened, as there still is today.
Right. That's a great point. I'll give it to Kyle here in just a second, but I just want to say that, you know, even honest materialists like Jonathan Schaffer admit that analytic philosophy was born in sin, with this misunderstanding that Russell and Moore had. So you're absolutely correct. And even materialists who know their history agree with you. So anyway, Kyle, go ahead. You got another question?
Yeah, it was just a follow-up. So when people talk about the epistemological idealism, but not ontological, and they say it's a leap of faith, it doesn't sound very valid. It sounds good. It's just,
Well, it's a good refutation of a straw man,
yeah,
because it assumes that the argument for idealism is purely epistemic, and it's not. There are many facets to the argument for idealism. You see, the thing that is hard for people to grasp, when a certain metaphysics become dominant in a culture, it's very hard for most people, I think, to abandon its premises, even when they are trying to do so. It comes back hidden and bites them in the butt. And let me give you a concrete example. Most people who are not idealists, but hear of idealism, they think, oh, it's the theory that everything is in our heads. No, that's materialism. Materialism is the notion that all qualities of experience are produced by your brain inside your skull. And idealism is precisely the one saying it's not all in your head, because your head is not a thing. Your head is a representation. But under the ethos of materialism, minds can only exist associated with living beings. There is no mind at large in nature. And that's why they misunderstand it. Because if an idealism says everything is in mind, then obviously everything has to be in someone's head. Because minds only exist bounded by the boundaries of living beings. Mind and life come hand in hand. But that's a materialist premise. So if you want to give idealism a fair hearing, you need to understand idealism in its own terms. Under idealism, mind is fundamental. It's not generated by living beings, so it's not bound to skulls. And that's why for idealism, there is a mind at large. There are mental processes that are not confined to living beings and which create a context that in turn is inhabited by living beings. In other words, under idealism, there is an external world, really out there, really objective from our point of view, but mental nonetheless, because there is mind at large. But materialists have a very hard time understanding or even conceiving of mind at large. Sam Harris was on Lex Friedman's podcast last year, and he made exactly this Don Hoffman would call it a rookie mistake. I would just say it's a stupid mistake that is amazing for someone who brandishes around a philosophy degree. It's like you failed to understand the 1, 2, 3, the ABC of what you're commenting on publicly. But anyway.
Actually, just real quickly, we did touch about it real quick. There is one question from an anonymous. He basically asks if your idealism rests on indirect realism, like if, and what if indirect realism is false? Does your whole thing fall apart, or?
I don't think we can escape the notion that there is a real world that we don't create, that we cannot change at a whim, which is what it is, regardless of whether we like it or not, and continues doing whatever it's doing, regardless of our morning affirmations. So I am a realist. I think nature is real. It's really out there. It is mental in essence, but it's really out there. And you could call it indirect in the sense that I do not have direct access to that nature, in the sense that I'm an observer of that nature out there. I am not the nature out there. So it's a form of indirect idealism, you could say. But I find it logically and empirically, if not flat out impossible, at least extremely tortuous to avoid realism.
Okay. There's just a couple quick technical nitpicks. One of them jumps into QM. I know that's a bit of a jump, but so it's about wave function monism. True? Question mark. Reductionism false? Question mark. Does decoherence threaten your model of a cosmic mind?
No, anybody who understands decoherence technically knows that it has no philosophical implications. Decoherence is an operational thing. If a quantum system is in a superposition of possible states, if it touches a classical environment or interacts with a classical environment, like when it's touched by a probe during a measurement, it decoheres. And I will explain this in colloquial terms that are not very technically rigorous, but if there are physicists listening to this, I hope they forgive me, because it's very difficult to explain this without parting a little bit with rigor in a couple of sentences. The point of decoherence is that the information contained in the superposition is not lost when a quantum system interacts with a classical environment. That information is not lost. There is no real collapse. What happens is that the information in the superposition becomes diluted in a much larger classic environment around it upon an interaction. So that information is no longer accessible, and everything looks like collapse, but nothing really collapses. There is only a sort of dilution, a leakage of that information that was confined in a microscopic quantum system, in a superposition. That superposition information leaks out into the environment at large and becomes invisible, just like a drop of ink in the ocean becomes invisible. But the drop is still there. There was no collapse, nothing disappeared. Now, why does this not have any philosophical implications? Well, because how did the environment become classical in the first place? You see, operationally, the environment is classical. We look around and we see only one possibility. We don't see a cloud of probabilities. So operationally, the environment is classical. And if a quantum system in a superposition touches it, then that superposition information leaks into classicality and we can't see it anymore. But how do we account for the environment having become classical in the first place? And decoherence says nothing about that. In other words, it doesn't invalidate any interpretation of quantum mechanics whatsoever. Something that was understood by the fathers of decoherence, but people who understand only half of it think, oh, no, this quantum wave function collapse and mind causing collapse. We don't need any of that because decoherence already explained that away. It didn't. I don't think mind causes collapse, by the way. But the ones who do think that have not been refuted by decoherence if you actually understand decoherence. Now, can you repeat the first two parts of the question? I forgot them.
Wave function monism.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. wave function realism is the notion that reality, independent of observation, is Schrodinger's equation. It is that wave of superposed possibilities. It is the wave function. I think we have absolutely no reason to think that this can be true, because it's almost obvious that the wave function is a tool we created to describe what we know about the environment, about reality. And to say that the model that we made of what we know of nature is nature is supremely unjustified, and it carries the burden of justification. I don't have to refute it. People who think that have to justify why my little model of the world suddenly is the world, why it's supremely arrogant. Why would monkeys create a model that is the world? I mean, God help you if you're going to try to defend this. I empathize with you in the sense that I feel sorry for you. No, I don't think the wave function really exists objectively and independently up there. I think it's just the best model we have of what we know about the world, but it isn't the world.
Yeah, there's a follow-up because there's a couple of relativistic theories of consciousness coming up. Here, I can even just send you a thing. It's basically it seems to read it still keeps the hard problem of consciousness. They'll say it's between interactions of persons and things like that, but you can see in the comments or people following up with rebuttals that it's the problem's still there. You still have, okay, well, why does this give the arise or the illusion or of something of consciousness? I read over it, and I mean, they did great physics work, but I don't think they understood what they're yeah.
My favorite theory of consciousness is the following. Consciousness is the involuntary wiggling of my left big toe. That's what consciousness is. When I get nervous in my mind, my left big toe wiggles. Oh, that's consciousness. No, it correlates. Therefore, it is. I mean, I have a friend who calls these the Pinocchio theories of consciousness. If Pinocchio's wooden nose grows, oh, it's conscious. You can say in language, consciousness is this, consciousness is that. But this is just syntax. It has no meaning. It means exactly nothing. The best you can claim with proper underpinning is to say there is a correlation between mental states and these observable physical states. And the best correlation, in my view, so far, is Giulio Tononi's information integration theory, which found an empirical correlation between reportable mental states, in other words, meta-conscious states, and certain topologies of information flow in the brain. But I think if you would talk to Giulio today, well, if you'd talk to Christoph Koch, he would certainly tell you, yes, this is a correlation. It's an empirical correlation found based on observation. I think if you would talk to Giulio, he would say the same, because there are panpsychist philosophers working with them now to try to actually create a philosophical account or an account of the origins of consciousness, which in a sense isn't an account of the origins anymore anyway, because panpsychism takes consciousness to be a fundamental property, so it's not reducible. So they are not trying to reduce consciousness to topologies of information integration in the brain. It's just a correlation. But there are bozos out there who mistake language for reality and say, well, consciousness is the magnetic fields, or consciousness is the wiggling of the left big toe.
Yeah, so you pay no mind to these relativistic theories because, yeah, it just, yeah.
Yeah, it's just people trying to group fancy, portentous, important sounding words together. Like quantum and consciousness, and relativity and consciousness. Whoa,
Buzzwords.
No, go for it. No, way to go.
And did I hear you right? Did I think you said you reject that observation causes collapse? Was that right?
Yes, I reject that. I don't think
Okay.
human beings have the magical power to collapse the state of
Cool.
nature.
That's so cool because I've heard a lot of idealists make their case for idealism on that point, and I've always been like neutral. I've always been like, I don't know which it is because I'm not into physics, but I don't think I've always kind of have been suspicious of that tactic to try
Well,
to ground their idealism on that kind of line of reasoning.
I partly ground my idealism on quantum physics, but not collapse. I ground it on observations of entanglement that sort of prove certain inequalities like Bell's and Leggett's inequalities, and therefore defeat physical realism. In other words, defeat the notion that physical entities have standalone existence prior to observation, that they only exist upon observation. But I don't think this translates into collapse. I think what this translates into is the following. The world out there, as it is in itself before observation, is made of endogenous mental states, not physical ones. And states in some way akin to an emotion or a thought, something that cannot be described through a physical quantity, like how many meters does a thought have? How many kilos does an emotion weigh? You see, these are not physical states. They're endogenous mental states. And I think they are out there. That's what we measure. And physicality is a representation that arises upon measurement. And that's why for there to be physical entities, you need to observe. In the same way that the dashboard of an airplane will only show something if the airplane sensors are making a measurement on the states of the sky outside. If no measurement is made, the dashboard shows nothing. Now, in my view, physicality is the dashboard. If we don't measure, the dashboard shows nothing. In other words, there are no physical entities, but the thing measured is there, whether we measure it or not. So there is no magical collapse. I think the wave function is just a model of the world prior to measurement. And physicality does depend on measurement for the trivial reason that for the dashboard to show something, you need to make a measurement to be shown. So it doesn't grant magical powers of a consciousness to create a physical world out there, because there is no physical world out there. There is only a physical world in here, our own dashboard representations of the mental world out there. And our representations are mutually consistent because we are airplanes flying the same sky. So our dashboards are mutually consistent with one another. It doesn't mean that our dashboards are the sky. They're just showing consistent measurements of the sky. So we create physicality in here and not out there. And that's not magical. It's just as magical as you create your fantasy in your own mind. It's not magical, right? The physical world, the same thing. The physical world is in here. It's not out there. That it depends on consciousness doesn't grant consciousness magical powers to change the world, because the world is not physical. Physicality is an inner representation of the world. There is no collapse out there. There is an arising physical representation in here. Now, having said this, I don't think the consciousness causes collapse people are stupid. No, I think it's very reasonable to pursue that line, because as von Neumann showed us already in the 1930s, when two physical systems interact, they just become correlated. They become entangled. There is no reason for there to be a collapse. The superposition states just mix together and become entangled. So why, when we look at the world, it's not entangled? Well, that happens only in consciousness, right? Because even if you measure, like in a double slit experiment, even if you measure what's passing through the slits with an electronic detector, you only know what the measurement was when you, with your consciousness, looks at the output of the detectors. So it's reasonable to say, well, consciousness has something to do with collapse. My only point is, if you think this further and if you think this through, you arrive at the conclusion that there is no collapse up there. There is actually just the emergence of a representation in here. And that's what physicality is. It's an inner cognitive representation of the world. And the world is not changed because of our observation, at least not in the way of collapse. Of course, if you observe something, you interact with it, so there's always a change, but not that dramatic change of the world collapsing from a cloud of possibilities into one concrete reality. What we call concrete physical reality is just an internal representation.
All right. So yeah, I think that was a great explanation, and it's just good. It's good to know that idealists, you don't have to hold to this view that consciousness causes collapse to make your case. So thanks for that explanation. I thought that was very clear. So Kyle, did you have another question?
Yeah, it seems a double part. It's just a quick question about if conscious realism by Dr. Donald Hoffman is false, does it harm your idealism? And is Bernardo Kastrup's idealism falsifiable? But that seems like we just covered that a little bit.
Yeah. The first question, if Dawn's conscious agents theory is false, does it falsify idealism? No, no, because Dawn
Or
is
sorry,
he's in the
does it harm your idealism in general?
no, doesn't harm me either because of the following. Dawn is a scientist. He's trying to do science. So he's trying to have a mathematical model that predicts observations and even reduces the laws of physics to mathematically modelable interactions across conscious agents. So this is a predictive scientific effort. And as such, it can be overdetermining. In other words, it can bring more elements into it than you need for idealism to hold. It's a philosophical position. Don goes further. He makes it more specific in order to make it predictable. And in making it very, very specific, and recently he is bringing on board some very modern physical theories, quite complicated stuff, very specific stuff that he's bringing in from other physicists. And he may fail there, as any scientist can fail the moment they try to make a very specific, predictive, mathematically accurate theory. Does that mean that idealism, which is much more generic than whatever specific path Don is pursuing, that idealism itself would be refuted or contradicted if his specific predictive theory is contradicted? No, it doesn't mean that at all. That being the reason why I don't try to do what he's doing. Don one day could win the Nobel Prize. I could not, because I'm not in the business of science. I'm in the business of making the most educated inference we can possibly make about the essence of reality, what reality is, as opposed to how it behaves. Don is now in the business of predicting how reality behaves, predicting what reality will do next by reducing the laws of physics to mathematically modeled interactions of conscious agents. He may step on a mine or fall into a trap, because that's inherent to science. This is not exclusive to Don Hoffman. It's exclusive to anyone who ever tried to make theoretical science. But if that happens, that doesn't refute idealism at all, because idealism is 10 steps back from that. It didn't enter the minefield, if you know what I mean. It's not predicting the behavior of nature. It's just making the best inference we can about what nature is.
Yeah, it kind of like you're becoming less wrong, I guess you could say, if it was false, but you could say that about lots of theories, right? You're found out what's false, adjust it, and then it becomes more true, I guess you could say, or less false.
We could do
Yeah.
that, but
Yeah.
there is in my opinion, there's a higher likelihood. And I'm not saying this in detriment to Don Hoffman. It's intrinsic, it's inherent to the game. There's a high likelihood that Don's particular choice of what physical theory to use to underpin his model would turn out to be wrong. There's a high likelihood of that. That doesn't mean that reality isn't mental, because he is engaging in a very specific predictive effort. And if that fails, it doesn't mean that your previous understandings were all wrong.
And the follow-up where it says is Kastrup's idealism falsifiable. Well, I feel like when you get to these metaphysical layers, none of them are falsifiable. Really.
Well, falsifiability as proposed by Karl Popper in the 60s holds for scientific theories. Scientific theories are behavior predicting. They're models that are supposed to tell you what nature will do next. And they can never be proven true. all we can say is that nature's behavior has been consistent with this model so far. But nothing precludes the possibility that one day you observe a natural behavior that contradicts your predictive model, and therefore you have to discard it. So you can never devise an experiment that will conclusively prove a predictive model. Otherwise, you would have to test all conceivable states of nature, all conceivable circumstances, which is impossible. And our ability to isolate a system from, the environment around it is also limited. So falsifiability is what was used to replace the notion that we can prove a theory through experiment. Popper said, we can only try to falsify a theory through experiment. Because if nature contradicts a theory in one occasion, then the theory is wrong. One black swan is enough to prove the theory that not all swans are white. But if your theory is that all swans are white, and you make an experiment that shows the 10 swans you looked at are all white, you're still not proven. Because how do you know you've seen all swans, right? So that's falsifiability, and it applies to behavior predicting theories. Metaphysics is not a behavior predictive scientific theory. It doesn't predict what nature will do next. It's an inference about what nature is, not what it does. So falsifiability cannot be directly applied to metaphysics as it can be applied to scientific theories. In other words, if a scientific theory is not falsifiable, then it's bad. You can throw it away. But if a metaphysical theory is not falsifiable, then it's still in contention. That said, there are ways you can try to falsify analytic idealism. For instance, if, as analytic idealism predicts, the world as it is in itself, prior to observation, is physical, then physical entities have standalone existence and therefore have whatever properties they have, regardless of measurement. That's physicalism, right? Sorry, that's not analytic idealism. That's physicalism. Physicalism says the world as it is in itself is physical. Therefore, its properties are independent of measurement, because a physical entity is defined in terms of its properties. If it has standalone existence, then measurement simply discloses, reveals what the properties of the thing already were immediately prior to measurement. That's physicalism. Analytic idealism says, no. Reality as it is, the standalone aspect of reality is not physical. Physical measurements are a representation we make of reality when we observe it, when we interact with it. Physical measurements are a dashboard indication of our measurements of reality. What we call perception is our internal dashboard. Therefore, physical entities do not have standalone existence, just like the positions of the dials in the dashboard do not have standalone existence. They depend on the actual states of the sky outside. So you could try to falsify idealism by showing that under all conceivable circumstances, the building blocks of the physical world have standalone reality, and therefore their properties do not depend on measurement. Lo and behold, what we found is precisely the opposite. Their properties do depend on measurement, because if I have two entangled particles and I shoot one in one direction and the other in the opposite direction at the speed of light, say particles A and B flying in opposite directions and they are entangled, and Alice, the scientist, makes a measurement on particle A at the same time that Bob, the other scientist, makes a measurement on particle B, it turns out that what Alice chooses to measure about particle A determines what Bob sees when he looks at particle B. In other words, particle A and B do not have existence prior to measurement. What we call a particle, a physical entity, is not the thing measured. It's a representation that arises from measurement. So analytic idealism was not falsified that way. Materialism was. Another prediction. Under physicalism, all experiences are generated by the brain. So there can be no information in experience that's not grounded in a brain state, in information that you can see in brain state. Otherwise, you would have disembodied experience. So in all cases, the information contained in an experience should be traceable back to information in brain states. That's physicalism. Analytic idealism has a different implication. It says our experiences are not generated by brain states. Our experiences are the thing in itself, and brain states are what our experiences look like when observed from across a dissociative boundary. You see, it's a reversal of the error of causation. Experiences come first, and brain states are what experiences look like from a certain perspective. Now, in that case, the brain is not the generator of experience, but an image thereof. And unlike causes, images do not need to be complete. You are observing an image of me on your screen right now. That image is not complete. There's a lot of stuff happening on my back that you can't see. It's not represented in that image. There's stuff happening under my skin that you can't see. The image is not complete. So analytic idealism allows for certain circumstances in which the information in an experience is not traceable back to the image. It's not traceable back to brain states. The image may not be complete. Lo and behold, that's exactly what we find. You take psychedelics, you trip out of your head, you have the most intense, rich, evocative, significant experience of your life, or one of the top 5, according to Johns Hopkins University. And brain activity is significantly reduced, and it doesn't increase anywhere in the brain. Now, there are theoretical ways to sort of reform materialism and try to make it consistent with this observation that's now validated over more than 10 years, 11 years now, by saying that it's not brain activity that generates information, it's other stuff. It could be functional coupling or brain noise or activity variation. The problem is that whatever you choose, other empirical experiments will contradict that. Because when you dream, your dream experiences are directly proportional to brain excitation and not to noise or anything else. So yeah, in principle, analytic idealism is indirectly falsifiable. It doesn't need to be, but it is indirectly falsifiable. It just so happens that the 2 big instances that could have done so actually falsified materialism instead.
That's really interesting because right now you're just sitting back and just chilling.
Truth is not fragile, Kyle. You know, we can be stupid to the point of resisting it for 50, 100, 200 years. But it's not fragile. It will still be there. You know, you still bump your nose against it if you try to pretend it's not there.
Actually, you brought up, I was going to get to this a bit later, but in an Essentia Foundation interview, you were discussing contradictions of materialism, studies showing increased experience with decreased brain activity. The opposer was Dr. Slachter, and stated that these studies showed that it was a certain areas that shut down while others increased. So increased connectivity between pathways, possibly explaining the experiences. Unfortunately, you weren't given time to rebuttal. So what would you say to that?
Yeah, I don't quite remember this occasion, but I can comment on it anyway, because I still remember what I would have said. You cannot get away with a different materialist theory of consciousness for every different set of data. You can't do that. You cannot adapt your theory to circumstances, because this is like having the cake and eating it too. These different theories are mutually contradictory. Now, let's first address the point of fact, the claim that psychedelics reduce activity in certain areas and increase in others. I am still to see a paper that shows this. I have seen 10 years of papers showing the opposite, that activity reduces and does not increase anywhere. There is one paper in which a tiny increase was found somewhere, and the researchers themselves explained it away as experimental error, as part of the margin of error. So no, there is no study that I am aware of, and I followed it until a couple of years ago, and I sort of stopped after 9 years of this, showing an increase. What increases is some other measure, like functional coupling across brain areas. In other words, brain activity decreases, but whatever residual brain activity is left shows higher coupling across different brain areas. That has been observed. Another thing that has been observed is a minute increase in brain noise, which the researchers portentously call complexity or entropy. What they mean is just brain activity that doesn't follow any pattern. In other words, TV static in the brain. And it increases by a phenomenal amount of 0.005 in a scale from 0 to 100. In other words, it's a minuscule increase. And it is preposterous to say that such a minuscule increase in, of all things, brain noise accounts for the psychedelic experience. You gotta have a lot of balls to write this in a scientific paper. And people have written multiple scientific papers making exactly this claim, which shows the state of lunacy in which our culture is to try to preserve materialism. Now, even disregarding all this, you still cannot have 10 mutually contradictory theories of materialism holding. You have to choose one, but whatever one you choose, there will be a set of data that contradicts it. For instance, let's take the data from Japan a decade ago that showed that when you're dreaming, even if you're dreaming of something as dull, experientially poor as looking at a statue. I'm not inventing this. This is in the study. You're dreaming of looking at a statue, the most static, boring, experientially poor dream you could conceive. There are still identifiable activations in the brain that allowed the researchers to say, you were dreaming of a statue. Because through empirical correlation, we can make that guess. So when you're dreaming, experience correlates with brain activation, patterns of brain activation, not noise, not functional connectivity, not activity variability. It correlates with activation. But when you are under psychedelics, it correlates with noise. So which one is right? Now, you cannot have the cake and eat it too. And anybody who claims that, there was a guy who sent me an email the other day. It's naive, you will find it fun, but it reflects the state of our culture. He asked ChatGPT or GTP, whatever, that AI bot.
Here we go.
Yeah, he asked ChatGPT or GTP, do psychedelics increase brain activity? And ChatGPT answered yes. And he sent me an email saying, how do you respond to that? Who am I to contradict the wisdom of
he's got you. He's got you on that one. He's got you
but
there,
you
Bernardo.
Yeah, but the problem it illustrates is the following. Where do ChatGPT get its answers from? It gets its answers from written media. And some time ago, there was a paper published by a group in the Imperial College London showing that under psychedelics, I forgot which psychedelic they use. It was one of their myriad papers. Brain activity decreases. And there were 6 figures in their paper, 5 of them showing decreases of brain activity. A lot of blue, a lot of green, no red, no yellow. But there was one picture with a lot of red and yellow, and that was functional connectivity. In other words, brain activity reduced a lot, but the residual activity had more connectivity across different brain areas, more correlations across different brain areas, that residual activity. And CNN reported on this literally as saying, a study shows that your brain becomes a lot more activated when you are under the influence of psychedelics. And the researchers from the Imperial College did not correct that, although I prompted them to do so. Multiple times I prompted them to correct what the media was writing about them. The Guardian published an article on the same study, and they took, of the 6 pictures, they took the one with a lot of yellow and red, and they removed the legend. They removed the text saying what that yellow and red represented, which was functional connectivity. And then they just say, look, lots of red when the brain is under the influence of psychedelics, suggesting it lights up like a Christmas tree. So the media reports the opposite of what's being found. Some of the researchers misunderstand their own papers. I mean, I'm not going to elaborate on this, but this was a very public thing a couple of years ago. One of the researchers misconstrued the signal processing analysis in his own paper. He was not the first author, but the paper just concluded that activity variability increased, not activity. And this person went around giving interviews to the media, Washington Post, even wrote an article in The Conversation, claiming that activity increased in brain areas related to dreaming during psychedelics. He never corrected that, even though it's wrong. And the first author of the paper admitted that it is wrong. It was a wrong interpretation. So the media is awash with, I will not call it lies, because I think none of this is malicious or deliberate. I think it's dishonest to not correct it. That I think is flat out dishonest. It's careerist and dishonest. But the original lie, I don't think is malicious. But then it gets perpetuated to the point that now ChatGPT answers questions such as this by saying, oh, it does increase. No, the ChatGPT should read the technical articles. But of course, it's much more difficult for an AI to read a technical article full of graphs than to read a CNN report on it. Yeah. Okay,
just another reason to watch. No, that was excellent. Yeah, just another reason to watch out for the media, because that's so true. I'm glad you provided that concrete example, because I mean, it is true. Yeah, you got to watch out for the media. There's this kind of slogan I've heard, don't look at headlines, look at trend lines. Look at the studies for yourself.
Yeah, and you have to watch out for confirmation bias as well.
Yeah.
I mean, I and Professor Edward Kelly from the University of Virginia, we published an article on Scientific American 4 or 5 years ago, just talking about this confirmation bias in psychedelic research. They will look and entertain seriously anything to try to safeguard materialism, including the notion that an increase in brain noise, TV static in the brain, of 0.05 in a scale of 0 to 100 can account for the experiential content of a psychedelic trance. I mean, this is ludicrous. It's preposterous.
Yeah, I think it can be really ad hoc as well. Yeah.
It's just silly. And it gets published in the world's main academic papers, because if it has to be true, right? Because we know materialism is true. So even though this hypothesis of brain noise is preposterous, it's the best we have in order to reconcile the data with materialism, which we know is true, right? That's what's happening.
I actually wanted, sorry.
Go ahead.
I know this is feeding the trolls, but you can see it in some blog post stuff about Bernardo Kastrup. There's some he's deliberately manipulating science. He's creating a religion or lying to people. He's trying to dupe audience with non-falsifiable claims. I don't know if I should mention him because I would be giving him clout, but
I don't know who you're talking about anyway.
Okay.
The answer is no. I'm not doing any of those things.
But they're trying to oh, he said there's no he's making his own religion, and there's his one of the rebuttals were memories are stored in the brain. Of course they are, but if you watch your interview with Shermer, it's irrelevant if it is or isn't. So it's cherry picking for him.
There are people. I mean, how can we even start speaking about people's motivations and their psychology? There's all kinds of reasons for people to say that whatever one would enter the debate defending, whatever position one would enter the debate defending, there would be people like this. I'm not going to comment on idiocy. Sorry. I'm not going to waste my time.
Yeah.
But memories in the brain. Yeah. Let's comment on memories in the brain. I mean, it's a good excuse to speak about something else that is interesting. Over the past 20 years, there have been at least 5 that I have counted, 5 claims that we've found memories in the brain. And not only by the media, but by the PR department of the corresponding universities. This takes it one level higher. Huh? And it's the PR department of the university itself that has issued press releases in conjunction with the publication of a neuroscience paper claiming we figured it out. We found the mechanisms of memory. And then when you go and you read the papers, it is amazing how far away it is from that claim, to the point that it has nothing to do whatsoever with the claim. I'll give you one example without mentioning the title of the paper because I no longer remember. But in one of these claims that, okay, we found memories in the brain, and you go read the paper, what did they find? I'll tell you exactly what they found. They took a set of subjects and they had them watch a video clip. And they recorded the patterns of their brain activity while they were watching that video clip. And then they took these people away, and in the next session, they came back They were instrumented again to measure their brain activity, and they were asked to remember the video they watched. So they closed their eyes and they remembered the video, and the brain activity patterns were measured. Lo and behold, the activity patterns during watching the video and remembering the video were very similar. That's it. That's it. That's the study that discovered where brains are stored, where memories are stored in the brain. Now, it has found no such a thing whatsoever. Where was the information stored that allowed the brain to remember the video and therefore generate that activity, brain activity that is similar to the brain activity of watching the video in the first time? That's the question. How did the brain know to generate the same patterns of brain activity again? How did the brain do that? Where did it get the information from? No, this is not addressed at all in the study. And they claimed they figured out the materialist account of memory in the brain. And if you look at these 5 claims, they are totally mutually contradictory. Some of them talk about neuroactivity patterns across neurons in large areas, usually involving specific areas of the brain that have to do with memory pathways. Others talk about intraneuron mechanisms. One of them talked about a DNA-related mechanism. In other words, these are mutually contradictory things. It either takes networks of neurons to store a memory, or it takes a mechanism inside the neuron, or it takes a mechanism inside the nucleus of the neuron. They cannot all be right, and they all make the claim that they figured it out. None of them has come even close to it. But if you type on Google, physicalist accounts of memory or where brain is stored, you get a lot of hits to academic papers and PR press releases of academic departments claiming exactly that. Remember, this is not to take a jab at academia. It's a reality that they have to confront. All of these groups depend on grant money. They need donors, they need money in order to pay their own salaries and their students and laboratory equipment and all that. And they are competing against each other for that. And unfortunately, the ones that get more money are the ones that make the more spectacular claims, because it sounds like they are making the most advancements. And they engage in this. They are selling themselves. Scientists, they get a performance review every year. No, I've been there. They get a performance review every year in which they look at how many publications you have and what's the score of the journal in which you published. So you find yourself in a position in which you have to publish every year, even if you have nothing to say, because your study is so professional, is so careful, that it can only produce results after 3 or 5 years. But no, you cannot get away with that. You have to publish your bloody papers every year. So you will publish shit. You publish half-baked shit. And your PR department will make even worse claims about your half-baked shit. Otherwise, they don't have the money to pay themselves and you and your PhD students. This is reality.
It's true. I've heard the phrase publish or die.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. That's why I'm so happy I'm with the Essentia Foundation now. We have the means and the time to do things right.
See, yeah, this is why I'll take jabs at academia. If you don't want to take jabs at him, I'll take jabs at him for you, Bernardo. We'll take care of him. No, go ahead.
They do some very good stuff too, and they do some very important, very good stuff.
Yeah. Of course.
I have a fun question here. It's different, but so it's a follow-up. So if a dead body is an echo within mind at large and or being sustained within conscious agents of this world, I guess that's a hint at Donald Hoffman. What about long buried random bones, fossils, and mummies? Yeah.
Okay.
That's a quick one.
Yeah. Fossils have nothing to do with the original organism. Fossils are formed by mineralization. In other words, it's dust and soil that accumulates around the original bone. And as the bone disappears, those minerals take the shape of the bone that was there. That's mineralization. So a fossil has no vestige of the original bone. It's just rock in the shape of the original bone. That's mineralization. Mummies. we are interacting with the world, and we change the world by interacting with it. We like to call that interaction physical, when we take a broom and swipe the floor, or when we perform surgery, or when we mummify a body. Now, the broom, the scalpel during the surgery, or whatever, the cloth that you used for mummification, we like to think of them as physical entities. But remember, under analytic idealism, physical entities are always and only representations of mental entities. So in the real world out there, there is no scalpel, there is no broom, there is no cloth. Those two are representations of mental processes out there in mind at large. So mummification is itself the appearance, the image, the dashboard representation of a mental process. The mental process of preserving a mental echo. And it works. You can preserve that mental echo by mentally reinforcing the echo, because everything is mental under idealism. Now, I could give you the physics of it, but we can keep an echo going forever so long as we feed energy to it in just the right way. That's mummification, the metaphor for mummification. You add just the right amount of mental energy to keep that mental echo going. And when we observe that process, it gets represented on our dashboard as what we call mummification, with bandages and salt and all that good stuff. That's a mental process of keeping a mental echo going for longer. Not forever. Eventually it will dissipate, but you can keep it going for quite a while. No surprise there.
Yeah, so you mean echo, not ego. I hear ego.
Sorry, yeah, I said echo, but echo.
Yeah,
Sorry,
okay.
I meant
So
to say echo throughout.
yeah, well, I was like, what would they be experiencing? The next one is actually pretty good. So it says universal mind. It's about the meta consciousness. So universal mind must be meta conscious to some extent, question mark. It has memories of each of us, which are meta conscious, meaning at some point will the universe or universal mind be meta conscious itself. Like it will wake up. And there's a part after that.
I think the spirit of it is correct. Yeah, I may, because I'm influenced by the analytic school a lot. I tend to sort of split hairs on the meaning of terms a little bit. So let me start by saying, yes, correct. The spirit is correct. Now, why would I split hairs here? Because meta consciousness, I refer to it as a capability, not the result of using that capability. So when metaconscious beings die, their metaconscious insights are preserved in mind at large. And therefore they increase the metaconscious insights of mind at large. It doesn't mean that mind at large has the capability to generate its own metaconscious insights from scratch. You see what I mean? Think of it like you go shopping. You go to the supermarket and you buy all the stuff you need and you're richer for it, but you don't have the capability to make that stuff yourself. So mind at large goes shopping with us. It's doing a harvest when we are no longer dissociated. So it gets the goodies, it gets the metaconscious insights. But I wouldn't refer to mind at large as being metaconscious, because in my use of the terminology, that implies having the capability to generate its own metaconscious insights. And that it doesn't, in my mind. It can only do that through proxy, through life, which has evolved that capability.
Okay, so this one's needs a little unpacking, but it's just a follow-up. So universal consciousness, although not metaconscious, it must be aware of itself, but hang on, meaning it's aware that it is experiencing itself. And then there's a part here. So in the Adventures of Awareness, a couple months back with Rupert Spira, he took everyone through a meditation, and you joined us, and you said, there is a moment when you're just aware, but it's not nothing. You're not aware of being aware, but you're aware. And that is splitting hairs. And a lot of people are like, please ask Bernardo for a follow-up.
Rupert and I, for a long time, we thought we had a small point of divergence because he always says the fundamental feature of consciousness is that it is aware of itself. And in my mind, explicit self-awareness is not fundamental. Awareness is the ability to have experience is, but the ability to know that you are having a particular experience is not. That's metacognition, and it has evolved over 4 billion years on this planet. So we thought we had a divergence here. And then we had a conversation, I think even live, or at least in public, in which we discovered that no, we mean different things here. When Rupert says that consciousness is fundamentally aware of itself, what he means is that when consciousness has an experience, what is that experience? It is itself, right? So that is the sense in which he says that consciousness is fundamentally aware of itself, in the sense that whatever it experiences, it is itself. So it knows itself by direct acquaintance, but not necessarily by explicit introspection. In other words, consciousness can be aware of itself without carrying the thought, oh, I am now experiencing myself.
So
that's not needed.
Sorry. It says that, so in that deep meditative state, you're just purely aware. You know you're aware because you're experiencing the awareness, but you're not aware that you know that you're aware. So when you say the universal mind is not metaconscious, it's like in a deep meditative state that we were kind of in during that talk, kind of?
No, I don't think so. No. So I was getting there. So the first point I wanted to make is that there is no divergence between me and Rupert. When I say self-awareness, I mean explicit self-awareness, metacognition. And he doesn't mean that. All he means is that by experiencing, merely by experiencing, consciousness is an acquaintance with itself. And it is, because there's nothing else to be experienced but itself. But in his language, that doesn't imply metacognition. So we don't have a divergence there. It turns out that we actually agree. Now, that fundamental state in which there is no metacognition, and there is also no experience that you can name. And it's possible to get there through meditation. It's when the mind is so profoundly at rest that there is no experience of a thing or a phenomenon. There's no discernible thing being experienced. And yet, when you come back from that state, you remember it. Therefore, you experienced it. Therefore, there was experience. It was not only the potential for experience. There was a experience, but it's not a characterizable experience. People say it's the experience of emptiness. Well, if it's empty, how can it be an experience? So there seems to be a kind of contradiction there. I don't think that is the state of mind at large right now. Why? Because if this were the case, then our representation of mind at large on our dashboard would be empty. In other words, space would be a vacuum, black vacuum. And it's not. It's brimming and teeming with galaxies and galaxy clusters and black holes and quasars and all kinds of stuff happening out there. Stars going supernova, nebulae and galaxies colliding. I mean, it's the pulsars. There is a lot of stuff. Moons with volcanoes erupting, ice volcanoes very, very close by in our neighborhood here. If this is what's happening on the dashboard, it doesn't mean that this is literally what's happening out there. Now, the dashboard is a representation, but the representation does exactly what the name implies. It represents. So if the representation is going all over the place, then there is something out there that is very dynamic. It's not static. It's not empty. Stuff is happening. So I don't think mind at large is in that state of total peacefulness in which there is no particular nameable or characterizable experience. There is only that primary experience of being aware, which I would model theoretically as a sort of a carrier wave. That the basic drone, constant vibration that is on the background of everything. And every other experience is a modulation of that. Like the voices you hear in the radio are the modulation of the carrier wave that defines the frequency of that radio station. So I think mind in general, mind at large, the mind of nature, is never completely static. Otherwise, it would pop out of existence. There is always a carrier wave, a drone, the drone of Indian music, that one unchangeable note in the background. And what we call existence are modulations of that drone, of that carrier wave. But I do not think mind at large right now only has an unmodulated carrier wave. No, I think it's a wild whitewater river out there. Because when you look around us, there is wild stuff going on.
Yeah, I want to push it just a tad further.
Sure.
So sometimes you call the drone in Hinduism, it's like pure awareness. You call it, so when you're at that absolute rest, let's push it till just flat potential. In that state under analytic idealism, it still must be like something. It can't be like oblivion. It's that core subjective first person awareness at rest would still be that deep meditative non-meta conscious state. But it is experiencing, because if you did wake up, you're like, oh, I had something during that. It wasn't nothing, it was something, but it's that deep. Yeah, it's hard.
Well, Kyle, I don't have, I cannot make a philosophical argument for the impossibility that this field of subjectivity that underlies all nature can be at complete rest. It is coherent with analytic idealism that there is the possible state of being in complete rest. Because under analytic idealism, experiences are modeled as excitations of subjectivity. And subjectivity can be visualized as a field. And those excitations can be visualized as vibrations of the field, like the vibrations of a guitar string. The same guitar string can produce multiple notes, depending on which particular vibration it takes on. So analytic idealism would say there is only one field of subjectivity in nature, and all the complexity and variety and dynamics of nature can be accounted for as particular patterns of excitation or vibration of that single unitary underlying field. It is coherent under analytic idealism that that field can potentially take on the state of being in complete rest and not having any excitation at all. And then you would have still fully the potential for experience, but you wouldn't be having any experience because experience is modeled as a excitation of the field. If the field is not excited, then there is no experience, there is only the potential for experience. This is entirely analogous to how quantum fields are used in theoretical physics today. Particles are excitations of the quantum field, but the quantum field can be at complete rest, in which case it's the vacuum. In other words, a field at complete rest in physics is nothing. It's not no thing. There is still the potentiality there, but the potentiality is exactly that. It's a potential to exist. It's not existence itself. So under analytic idealism, there can be only the potential for existence. In other words, the potential for experience, and no experience as such. And the potential is still there. And nothing would be lost. Just like a guitar string that doesn't play any note loses nothing. It's still complete. It's still there in full, even though it's not behaving. So it's conceivable under analytic idealism that there is a state of no experience whatsoever. But that's not what people report. So I think, at least insofar as human beings, living human beings are concerned, that state of pure nothingness doesn't seem to be possible because people come back reporting on the experience of nothingness. So it was not nothing. There is something to be remembered. There was a drone, there was a bass note, a carrier wave there. It's possible that outside human beings, the mind of nature one day can come to a state of perfect and complete rest. I don't know. I cannot exclude that possibility.
It's interesting because if you say that right at the base, what people have come back and told, well, we get that complete rest, that drone in itself is experiencing the rest, which is not nothing, but it's like that quiet, core subjective I, just still. Interesting.
But if you remember that, then there was
After,
some
yeah.
kind of experience.
I have a question here. It's about your clarification of myth. So for all those that read more than allegory, religious myth is a controversial term these days, which may connote as being untrue, yet is interpreted many ways. All these religious myths could point to perennial truths. Some reoccurring examples include God, universal mind, conscious realm, afterlife, conscious after death, enlightened persons, higher meaning, etc., etc., etc. So it is not a myth per se, as in a falsity, but as a non-literal means to a deeper truth that is an absolute truth, like conscious after death, God, etc., and hence a perennial truth. He continues and says, in more than allegory, you speak of myths pointing towards those truths. It seems consistent to say that all these religious myths point to perennial truths, some of which include, again, God, godlike mind, uh, afterlife, continued conscious value, meaning. And then he concludes and says, also, although there are cultural differences, it seems cogent to conclude it is all pointing to an actual truth and hence a sort of perennialism.
Uh, uh, I will agree, but before I agree, I need to make the disclaimers. I have a friend, Jeff Kripal, who's a professor of religious studies. He's the dean, I think, at University in Texas. And he already warned me, even before the book, More Than Allegory, that if you really look at all the religious myths across the world, they are vastly different and they are mutually contradictory. It's all over the place. And that is true. That is true. But that doesn't refute the possibility that there are true intuitive inspirations underlying those religious myths that have had worldwide appeal and therefore turned into the world's main religions. Because why did they spread like wildfire? I mean, Christianity spread like wildfire. In a couple of 100 years, it was the official religion of the Roman Empire, the biggest empire to rule the earth. That's amazing. Not only that, it was the empire that killed the martyr of the Christian religion, that crucified the guy and the main enemies, and they adopted it. And only thought, it's amazing, Christianity tops it, right? And then came Islam. And it spread even faster. It unified what were nomad Arabic tribes into a true civilization with extremely rich culture and identity, and finds nuanced philosophy, like the classical philosophy, for instance, of Shiite Islam, which doesn't get much talked about. You usually talk much about the other side of Islam. So these things spread like this because they resonate with something very deep in the human psyche, something that does not depend directly on the cultural dispositions of the time. It goes deeper. It grabs you by the balls, if I can speak in polite language. It's not like you adopt it. It adopts you. It pulls you in. Buddhism is similar. Hinduism, also one of the world's greatest religions. So I would say that these religions, if interpreted in depth, not superficially, because then you kill it. Then you make a mockery of the founders. You make a mockery of the prophets. They were not silly people speaking silly platitudes. They spoke with depth and nuance. They tried to communicate things that are largely ineffable, that can't be put in words. And their talent was precisely to find a way to point at those things with words, with parabolas, with symbols, icons. That was their ability. And even the religions that never adopted iconography, such as Islam, the prophet worked with the magic of words. not of icons. Therefore, to give him a fair interpretation, to respect him for the prophet that he was, we cannot just interpret it literally. I think that's offensive to the old fathers, to the prophets, and the old mothers, to the people that were there in the beginning of a religious stream. And then what happens afterwards is that because of power games, politics, social and psychological things, there are all kinds of spin-offs, distortions, split off groups, or made up religious myths that are made up in order to combat. And then you have the circus. And then the circus that Jeff Kripal was talking about comes into being. And that's, of course, not the real thing. That's not the real stuff. That's the human ego playing power games in a society, playing power games in the psychology of the ego.
Yeah.
So having said all this, the point is, I agree. I think the world's deepest and therefore most popular, historically most popular religious myths, if interpreted with depth, sensitivity, and nuance, they do point at perennial truths.
Yeah, I agree. It seems interesting because you do see those things recurring, like the after death state and mind, underlying nature, etc. And it seems coherent with your idealism too. So I think it's fair. This one ties in nicely to Easter time. I got a question here as self and resurrection. So as mentioned by Bernardo, the West has a different path from the East, Buddha, Krishna, etc. This Western path is aligned with the paths of Christ. Now, as idealists and those for looking for an alternative to a substance dualistic framework, how can a Christian or those sympathetic to Christianity hold resurrection in idealistic framework? He mentions a couple things real quick. I'll just summarize. Being memories in the body and universal mind, you dissolve into the whole, and the segments are gone, but you disperse in a broader context. So your subjectivity is still there. There could be a deeper layer you fall onto. The Jungian metaphor about the plant dying in winter, but next spring it returns. And then perhaps as absolute idealists, we need not to come to this conclusion that if all is one unindifferentiated field of activity, then yes, you, the core subjectivity, in this form die, but the true you, the pure awareness, is all there is, and that I-ness continues, like waking up from a dream. So it seems like he's done his Kastrupian homework. Yeah.
There is a amazing psychological tendency people have to think that if you don't survive as an ego, even if you understand that you were never the ego and nothing really is being lost, there is still that irresistible disposition to think that, yeah, in fact, something very important is being lost. Unless I survive as Bernardo Kastrup, the ego, then whatever you say, Bernardo, something about you that's very important is going to be lost. There's a tremendous psychological tendency to think that, even though I would say this is profoundly irrational. It's as irrational as to say the following. You're having a dream just before you wake up in the morning, and then you wake up, and your dream avatar is dead. He didn't survive the process of waking up. And then you go start crying because you think something fundamental was lost. You lost your dream avatar. He's dead. Do we cry? Do we mourn the death of our dream avatar? We don't. Because it becomes obvious that nothing was lost. It was you all along. And your state changed. And even that's not a loss because you remember the previous state. Nothing was lost. And not even the potential for future states in the form of the dream avatar are lost. Because you can fall asleep again and dream on. I have had dreams that were continuations of previous dreams. So even that is possible. But we still think, well, if I don't survive as John Smith, then I actually really die. I really die. That is the insane perspective of the dream avatar. It isn't real, but people have tremendous difficulty in understanding this. And there comes the power of Christianity. The West was not born with Christianity. The West was going on for 1,500 years before Christianity. No, wait. 500 years before Christianity. Sorry for my poor math. The West had been going for 500 years before Christ walked the earth. 800 years before Christianity became mainstream. But Christianity played, of course, a tremendous role. And look at how fantastic the Christian myth is in addressing precisely the psychological tendency that I just described, which is probably historical, has always been there. Jesus died, and then he resurrected and ascended, which is just like waking up permanently. To ascend is to wake up permanently. So he died and he woke up because he ascended. But something very important happened for a month in between. He came as flesh. It was temporary, but he resurrected as flesh, as if to say, if you idiots haven't understood it yet, nothing is lost, okay? Touch the wound, Thomas. And then he ascended. It's a fantastic myth. Oh, I get Kippevel. How do I say this? Kippevel?
Goosebumps.
Goosebumps. I get goosebumps when I think of the Christian myth. All the way from Genesis to the end of the New Testament with the Apocalypse. If you have the eyes to read it. So yes, and that's the message that the West must read. We can't take the message literally anymore. There are reasons to think this is good and reasons to think this is bad, because by not taking it literally, we lost our emotional engagement with the meaning of the myth. In other words, we think it's just a myth. We don't really believe it anymore. There is a sense in which it's better to erroneously believe it literally than to not believe it at all. And there are other senses in which it's even worse to believe it literally than to not believe it at all. But it's a trade-off. But because now we only believe history and not myth, we have to find a way to revamp the myth in a manner that survives intellectual inspection. And that's our difficulty, because we are so attached to literal truth that we cannot see any other layer of truth, like the Eastern people can. No, the Indians, they didn't record their history. There are very few records about Indian history, which is the longest history of any civilization on this planet. You know, they were there before everybody else. And there are very few records. Why? Why do the Indians not care about their history? They don't record which king, when, did what. Because they know that every king, like Plato's forms, is just an instance of the archetypal king, which is the only true reality. Every war is just an instance of the archetypal war, which is the only true reality. So they don't care about recording the instances. They only care about recording the archetypal reality. And they record that in the form of a myth, which is not to be literally interpreted. It's not literally truth. It's a reminder of the archetypal truths that we all inherit by the mere fact that we exist. And that's all they care about. But they can do that because they take the myths seriously. We can't, because for us, myth equals a fairy tale.
Yeah.
Myth equals untruth. Therefore, we need the real kings. We need Henry V and Henry VIII and the wives he beheaded, and the great battles that, the great battle of Leipzig, that, one of the first great defeats of Napoleon. I was there the other day. Even I need that. Knowing what I know, I'm still a Westerner. I can't abstract away from what I am. So yeah, that's why it's dangerous for us to replace our own Western mythology with Eastern one, because the Eastern mythology caters to sensitivities and dispositions that are different from ours. Now, make no mistake, Eastern mythology has saved our butts. They threw a lifeline to us when we were in the dark ages of logical positivism and behaviorism, when we were more lost than any civilization before us, to the point that we were in hell, and they threw us a lifeline because their myths are more nuanced, and it appealed to our intellect a little bit more. Like we sensed some sophistication that is also there in the Christian myth, but we could no longer see it after all this history we had with it. So they threw us a lifeline, and they kept us alive, and we should be thankful to them, just as we should be thankful to Islam for having saved our culture when we went down the path of the Dark Ages for 1,000 years. And they preserved our own history, our classics, our culture, our technology, and then they gave it back to us during the Renaissance. In exactly the same way, I think we should be very thankful to the Hindus, to the Buddhists, and even to Islam again, in the form of, for instance, of mystic Islam or Sufism, for having saved our lives. But that doesn't mean that we should throw away our own inheritance and adopt theirs, because theirs is for them. It's their inheritance. It was made for their sensitivities, for their dispositions, not for ours. And we have great names. It's not about comparing one tradition to another. I've given that up a long time ago, but we also have great names. We have Parmenides, we have Empedocles, we have Plato, we have Kant, we have Hegel, we have Schopenhauer, we have Jung, we have great names. We have, I'm trying to go to the Americans now. The fact that I'm having difficulty remembering the names does not mean that I consider them any less valuable. It's just that they are less present in my daily life, and because the medicine I take.
It's true. There's only so many of them. Yeah, that's okay.
The father of psychology,
William James, was an idealist. Yeah.
And that guy who went live in the forest.
Josiah Royce, Ralph Waldo Emerson.
Yeah. So sorry about that. I take amitriptyline. And
I was thinking of some too. You're not alone.
So we have our own treasure buried in the garden, and the others kept us alive. For what? For us to rediscover our bloody treasure. And I think that's what we should do. That's what we must do if we are to do something about the epidemic of anxiety and depression that we are living through.
Beautifully said. I just wanted to double back. I think what he was getting at too is that he's trying to see if we can use the idealistic framework you posit and follow the argument and say that, well, if our consciousness has nowhere to go, then it would be fine to say that Jesus's subjectivity literally continued after his death, and that was the resurrection. It returned to the universal mind. I think that he's trying to make a joinder where you can have the myth and then the literal truth of resurrection as well. And I think it follows.
I think the danger of sophisticated intellectual minds like the three of us, and probably the vast majority of your listeners, if not all of them, is that because we know that certain things cannot be literally true, but they are true in another way, we are still unable to muster the emotional engagement with those truths because they are not literal. In other words, even if we intellectually understand that they are true in another way, it's still like, yeah, it's something abstract and far away. What would really mobilize our emotional engagement would be if they were literally true. But we lost that. We know too much now. And we can't mobilize that emotional engagement. We engage intellectually, abstractly, like, yeah, there is a sense in which they are true. And there is this guy, Bernardo Kastrup, who can even put words to it. So I believe it, but it doesn't really change your life anymore because you're not emotionally engaged with it. You're engaged with it here, but not here in the throat, in the chest, in the heart. So it doesn't really change your life. That's our great danger. That's the danger of knowing too much, of being too intellectually sophisticated. And there is a sense in which, given this, and I say this in the book, so I don't, the genie is out of the box, so I don't mind repeating it. It may be useful to believe a religious myth as if it were literally true, even though deep inside you know it's not. In other words, you will be closer to the truth. You will be living your life in a way that will do more justice to truth if you believe a religious myth literally than if you don't at all, if you don't have any emotional engagement with it. But it is a delicate trade-off because it requires the intellect to give permission to something it knows is not intellectually true, and to give emotional permission to you, to give intellectual permission for your emotional engagement to something it knows is not literally true. It's difficult to do. And if you succeed in giving yourself this kind of license, there is another even bigger danger, which is you become judgmental. So now not only will you live as if the myth were literally true, you will judge others as if the myth were literally true. And you will say the Muslim is inferior, or the Protestant is inferior, or the atheist is inferior. And that's dangerous. So it's a very narrow road to navigate, to hike on. And there is a precipice on one side and a precipice on the other. If we don't walk that road, life will be less meaningful. We'll be vulnerable to depression and anxiety. We'll fail to see the meaning of the whole thing and to live in a way that does justice to nature. But if we do walk that road, we can fall on either side, and either side is terrible. And that's the challenge for Western civilization. How can we recover our true emotional level relationship with religion without falling into the trap of fundamentalism on the one hand and of atheism in the other? Mm-hmm. Both of which you fall if you go too literal on it.
Could you zoom out to perennialism then? Go back to the perennialism and kind of view all as equal, you could say?
Well, I would say just don't judge. Who are we to pass judgment? All we can do is to make the best we can of our own lives. To pass judgment on people who are not robbing anybody of their liberty is useless. You're only forced to pass judgment when there's somebody coming into your house and stealing your stuff, raping your wife. Then you have to pass judgment and you have to react to that, like Europe is doing right now. That's inevitable. But when people are living their own lives, who are we to judge? So, and that's the danger of going too literal, because you begin judging, because there are very judgmental words in the Bible. It's not an edifying text throughout. There's horrible stuff in the Bible. We keep saying of the horrible stuff there is in the Quran. People who say this clearly have never read the Bible, because there is stuff in the Bible about, calls to kill one's children, and there is stuff there that you go like, oh my God. But even that has a symbolic meaning. Even that is telling you, this isn't a game. This is serious stuff. Your life is on the line. That's what it's saying. That this is for real. It's not romantic. No, it's for real. And our lives are literally on the line. But yeah, you have to have the eyes to see the deeper symbolic meaning. If you go literally, you become a menace to humanity. If you go too literally on that. But if you don't go literal at all, we lose emotional contact with it. And that's the problem. That's the difficulty. That's why I sympathize as much with atheists as with fundamentalists, because I see in them people who are making exactly the same mistake, just on the other side of the coin. And they're so busy fighting one another that they don't see the track, the path, the trail that leads to something fulfilling. But yeah, that's our lot. And perennialism, Kyle, perennialism, I don't romanticize it either. Perennialism just means that the truth is not fragile. And even if you're completely deluded and running around like a headless chicken, even you will bump against the truth every now and then, because it's what is. It's what is around. Yep. And of course, perennialism is true because we bump our noses against the truth every now and then, whether we want it or not. It's inevitable. So yes, there is perennialism. If you read things carefully, everybody who was really speaking from deep intuition and not just playing a power game in society or in a tribe, everybody was actually pointing at the same thing. That shouldn't be surprising at all. Even headless chickens bump against the truth every now and then.
This one would be good to talk about just the last bit. It's a hint that this idealism, universal mind, being God, kind of. They said the attributes of omnipotence, omniscience. I think you mentioned this in one of your books too. I can't remember which one it is though. Everything unfolds within the now, so it's omniscience. What are your thoughts on that? Universal
Well,
mind. Yeah.
it literally is true for this field of subjectivity underlying our nature that I think is the ontological primitive. It is the thing that we can reduce everything else to in nature, because a spatially unbound field of underlying field of subjectivity is one, omnipresent. It's spatially unbound. Everything else can be reduced to it, so it's everywhere. It's subjectivity, so it's conscious. So it's scient, conscious, literally means conscious in Latin. And omni means conscious of everything. Yes, it is conscious of everything that can be conscious because it's the only thing there is. So it is omniscient. And there is a sense in which it's omnipotent as well. It's not omnipotent in the deliberate arbitrary sense of a cosmic dictator, but it is omnipotent in the sense that anything and everything that happens in nature is a behavior of the underlying field of subjectivity. So whatever happens, happens by the grace of it, because it is the only thing that there is. It's the only thing doing anything. In that sense, which is a very literal sense, it is omnipotent, because whatever is done by it. Even though we think that it's done by other things, but these other things are reducible to it. Other people, astronomic phenomena, they are all reducible to patterns of excitation of this underlying field. So in a very important sense, it is omnipotent too. So there you go. It's omnipresent, omniscient, and omnipotent. And that's how Christianity characterizes God.
It's interesting because that sounds like it hints at what St. Thomas Aquinas would mention as the ground of being. It's mental. Interesting, as the everything that can happen within it does, omnipotence, etc. But it's a mental foundation, and I know the Thomists are going to tear me apart, but you can see it.
Well, even if you don't refer to scholastics, even after, Christian mystics have always seen this. Who said that the eye with which I see God is the same eye with which God sees me?
That's not Nagarjuna or anything. No, you're talking
No,
Western.
no.
Western,
The Christian, who was it again?
Am I?
It's a Christian mystic.
Oh gosh,
I
I'm drawing a
forgot.
blank.
Me too. But that's
No, it was not St. Thomas. It was 200 years after
Well,
St. Thomas.
Palamas? No.
Who?
Wait, Gregory Palamas?
No.
No.
I forgot. I'm drawing a blank.
That's okay.
But it happens these days with me.
But this is interesting though, because you have these literal interpretations of God. You have the continuation of consciousness after death, whatever, wake up from the dream. You do have those building blocks from what this is ruining it a little bit, but what Jesus pointed to, what other,
Of course.
it's okay. You can start seeing it. So,
even before Jesus.
Yeah, Krishna, you have Buddha, you had other things.
No. Stay with Christianity. Okay. Let's go back to the Jews exiled in Babylon 2,500 years ago, when they wrote Genesis. In Genesis, Adam and Eve were in the Garden of Paradise, in which you had no problems. And then they became explicitly aware of their nakedness. They knew that they were naked. It's written just like this. And I checked the original Greek to make sure that this is not an artifact of translation. After they took a bite from the fruit of the tree of knowledge, they knew that they were naked. That's metaconsciousness right there. That's the rise of metacognition, when we become able to separate ourselves from instinct In other words, when we become exiled from paradise and we become like God, because now we think we are an entity unto itself that can do things of its own accord. And that's why you become like God when you eat the fruit of the tree of paradise. And we become exiled from paradise. And if you look at paleoanthropology, there is overwhelming evidence that we were genetically what we are now since already 200,000 or 300,000 years. In other words, we had all the genes that allow for symbolic thinking, metacognition. We have had them for at least 200,000 years. But symbolic thinking only became expressed in the record about 30,000 years ago. In other words, we didn't fall into humanity. We fell as humans, just like Adam and Eve in the garden. We are already human. We already had all the genes to allow for symbolic thinking. Why? Nobody can explain. Actually, Ian Tattersall from the American Museum of Natural History, he wrote in his book, Masters of the Planet, 2012, he wrote, the only reason we have to believe that such a leap as the fall into metacognition could be made is that it obviously was made. Because otherwise we would have discarded this as a beyond implausible hypothesis. Why would this capability be affixed in our genome without being used for 170,000 years? It had no use. Why would it stay there? Why would it be selected for? There was no use to it. It only helped us consume more calories. But we didn't organize our collective work better through fictions like money and laws. We didn't invent writing. We didn't create civilization. We didn't practice agriculture. None of this stuff that now allows us to control the planet. We didn't do any of that stuff for 170,000 years. After the genes were already there, anatomically were already identical to what we are now. It's one of the greatest mysteries in paleoanthropology. One that we only believe happened because it obviously did. Otherwise, you would say, no, that's not how evolution works. That's not how psychology works, you know? And yet it happened. And then you go read Genesis in the Bible, and it's like, how did those Jews figure this out while exiled in Babylon 2,500 years ago? It's amazing. It's amazing. And the whole ethos of Christianity after that, in the New Testament, that life is sacrificial. That's the greatest lesson of Jesus. Life is sacrificial. It's not about you. Your life's not about you, has never been, will never be. And that's the greatest liberation. When you understand that your life is not about you, that's when you're free. It's the freedom of the slave. It's people don't understand that unless can talk about it for much longer than we can now. But that's the only true freedom, and that's the message of Christianity, and it fits. Just think about it. Who put the tree and the snake in the garden? Who made Adam and Eve have the disposition to not follow the rules? It's like God playing a trick on itself, which is, well, if I go down this path too much, and then I'll give words to the ineffable and it to not go well.
The rowboat in the ocean analogy. Since we're on the topic of, we mentioned death real quick. There's a bunch of NDE stuff that's been turning out with the Aware 2 study with Sam Parnia. Materialists are jumping on it for increases in I'll unpack it real quick. So a question floated around the NDE community that they want to hear from you about is how we are to interpret the new findings from Aware 2. The studies have found spikes of EEG brain activity during CPR and the early stages of death. Materialists are jumping onto this and proclaiming something similar to C. This is as expected. We told you so. They take it as a confirmation of materialism. So now people worry, does this threaten idealism? Or are there forms of idealism or metaphysical positions? And then there's a whole bunch of other things that unpack it, but that's the general thing. Yeah.
So there is no argument for idealism that depends on the veracity of near-death experience. Why not? Because under idealism, at least under analytic idealism and most objective forms of idealism, the body is what a particular configuration of mind looks like. It's the image of a particular configuration of mind. And not only the anatomy, but the activity of the body, brain activity, metabolism, all the stuff that is happening, not only the shape. This is what a particular state of mind in nature looks like, namely a dissociative state. Death is the end of the body, it's the end of the image, therefore it's the end of the dissociative state. So it would be entirely reasonable to say, under analytic idealism, that the moment you are no longer dissociated and therefore can report on a near-death experience, because for as long as you are dissociated, you're bound to your space-time locale and to your sense organs. So to have a transcendent experience like the NDE, your dissociation has to be largely gone to a great extent. And it's entirely reasonable, actually, it's what logic would point to you, that by the time the dissociation is unraveled sufficiently for you to have the experience, you would be unable to report on anything. Because to report, you need to be dissociated, to use your body, which is the representational language. To be able to exercise your body and report on something, you need to be in this state of mind. But to experience the thing, you need to be in another state of mind. Therefore, you can't report. So under analytic idealism, as a first pass of thinking, there should be no NDEs. Because either you're experiencing it and you can't report, or you can report, but you're not experiencing it yet. Mm-hmm. So the fact that NDEs happen sometimes is amazing, even under analytic idealism. The difference is that analytic idealism can still accommodate it, and materialism cannot accommodate it at all. Now, that's the first comment. The second comment is the following. Materialism has a few things going for it strongly today. None of them has anything to do with reason or empirical evidence. But there are a few important things going for it today. One of them is precisely its lack of explanatory power. Materialism today is mostly an expression of intellectual faith. Like, we believe that somehow the brain generates the mind, but we have no idea how. And this is a strength, because if you have no idea how, if you're not committed to a specific and overt explanation for how brain activity creates the mind, then any amount of brain activity, anywhere in the brain, of any type, unfolding according to any pattern, either measured or plausibly inferred, can be used to say, oh, materialism is true. You see?
Yeah, actually,
if there is one single neuron releasing one molecule of neurotransmitter anywhere, oh, materialism is true. Now, why can they do that? Because they don't explain shit. Yeah. Because materialism has an enormous explanatory gap right in the center of it. And in any sane society, that would be a reason to discard this immediately, to say, this is a non-hypothesis. It's purely an expression of faith, but it doesn't provide any account for its premises. It doesn't explain how we can make the reduction steps that it presupposes, like reducing mind to brain activity or brain function of some sort. Since it doesn't have that, we should discard it. But instead, that's precisely the reason we keep believing it. If it doesn't say anything, then anything goes. Anything is evidence for it. You see, even a minor metabolic rebound 60 seconds after your heart stopped beating, which is very reasonable, yep, that can account for any experience. You can go to the Pleiades and talk to aliens. Oh, it was a metabolic rebound. Why? Because a single neuron firing somewhere. Oh, materialism is right.
Actually, I wanted to just say, when you're debating with Christoph Koch and you're having Rupert Spira, you guys were talking about this momentarily. Christoph Koch said the NDE could occur during the waking up process from being pulled out of a prior state. But then that causes a real problem that you had this plentitude, this eternity of experiences happening within like a femtosecond. That then you have a problem with time.
You have more other problems. If so little brain anatomy and function is required to account for basically any experience, lifetimes recalled or whatever, then it raises the question, why are we born with a brain so big that kills women during birth? Our head is so big that it hardly passes through the birth canal. And unless we have modern medicine around, a large percentage of women used to die giving birth.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Because we want this, we need these big brains. We have these big brains, so they were useful for something. But if you can have basically any experience with a, a couple of neurons firing somewhere, then why this brain? Why? I mean, materialists, they play an interesting game. On the one hand, they say we need the brain for everything because experience comes from the brain. But on the other hand, they also say we don't really need a brain because a single neuron firing somewhere will do whatever it is that you're claiming as evidence. A microscopic percentage of the brain will do. So do they think we need the brain, or do they think we don't need the brain? And right now they play both sides of this question. They eat the cake and want to have it too. When it's convenient, they will say, we hardly need a brain. No, metabolic rebound, deep in brain structures that we can't even measure with an EEG, they will account for anything. And on the other hand, they say, if you don't have a full brain, you can't be conscious, because consciousness arises somehow, nobody knows how, from the complex interactions in that very complex organ. Which way is it? Do we need the brain or do we not need the brain? And that's what they have going for it, because they don't account for anything. They just they just put premises forward, like the mind should be reducible to the brain, but they don't account at all for how anything goes. Anything you observe is consistent with materialism. Why? Because materialism doesn't exclude hardly anything. And why don't they? Because they don't account for anything. If you don't account for anything in an explicit way, you don't exclude any evidence, and you can't be refuted. It becomes unfalsifiable, which is this state. I mean, it's okay to be unfalsifiable for metaphysics, but not to this extent. The spirit of metaphysics being okay, being unfalsifiable, is that you do provide an account. You do provide an explicit account for what you're proposing happens in nature. And it's difficult to falsify that account. But in this case, the account is not provided. Only a premise is provided. It should be the case that mind is reducible to the brain. And why do they do that? Because they mistake correlation for causation. There obviously are correlations between experiential states and brain states. But that can also happen if the brain is what the mind looks like under certain observation conditions. But they don't see any of that. Materialism is a knee-jerk philosophy, very unthought through, very unexamined, which becomes difficult to refute because it doesn't put an account forward.
No, and one thing I want to add to that is that what's happening now is they're moving definitions. So they'll say the time of death. So let's say you die, you have an NDE, whatever, but you come back. They'll say, well, you didn't really die. But then you could also open up the next part too, where it would be like, okay, let's say I could say that if I free someone who is dead, yet revive them 300 years in the future, well, they were never really dead because the death was reversible, right? So it's like, what are you doing? And then the next step is usually something like, so you said like brain activity is what conscious inner life looks like from a disassociated boundary. Okay, so it's good. But some people say, okay, the findings show metabolism still present or is possible in the early stages of death. EEG activity measures in number of patients. Some of it's near normal, possibly the type of associated with everyday conscious life. But that still doesn't seem to invalidate idealism, because...
Of course not. Idealism doesn't use NDEs as part of its argument.
No, but like they said, okay, the metabolism's still there. But yeah, that's what consciousness look like. Anyway,
Yeah,
it's just...
look, I think it's dangerous for us to take NDEs as the reason to discard materialism. I think it's not productive that we do that. It probably does refute materialism. But if we stick to it, it's dangerous, because you can never have a prospective study of NDEs. No. In other words, you can never select 10 volunteers and then kill them for a little while and see what they report back. That would not pass any ethics committee. Mm-hmm. And in the absence of prospective studies, the evidence can always be questioned, because only prospective studies are bulletproof when it comes to this. So if we stick to NDEs as an argument against materialism, it weakens the argument. Also because we don't need it at all. Materialism is internally contradictory. It has no explanatory power. Laboratory experiments in foundations of physics contradict it. Psychedelic research experiments contradict it. Why are we, all these studies are prospective, done under controlled conditions. And reason still holds the internal contradictions of physicalism when they take a description of the world through numbers and replace the world with the description, like replacing the map, replacing the territory with the map and trying to pull the territory from out of the map. These are internal contradictions that are more than sufficient to refute materialism. We don't need to go to NDEs. For me, my interest in NDE is the following. There is enough that is reported that I don't think we can dismiss it. Therefore, my concern is, can I accommodate this under analytic idealism? And I'm satisfied that I can. But that's it. There my interest stops. You will not see me singling out, I may mention it en passant, but you will not see me singling out NDEs as the reason to support idealism, because there are much better reasons.
Yeah.
Many, much better reasons.
Yeah, I'm in the same boat as you, Bernardo.
Yeah, and I think I mentioned this with MI just previously. You get this, the cultural milieu, and they'll go, okay, well, materialists will say, well, you're moving goalposts, this is wishful thinking, materialism will be right one day, and you get poo-pooing all the time. So it's like, anyway, yeah.
Materialism will not be mainstream.
Oh,
by 2000, certainly not by the end of this century.
but they'll change the name. They'll say, oh, we'll figure it all out, but it's always physicalism. But it's like,
Physicalism or something.
what are you doing? That's idealism.
That may happen. That may happen, but we are making enough noise about it now in anticipation of that move that it may preclude it.
Yeah.
I will not name names because this was a private conversation late at night between me and a very renowned, famous physicist. And we were having a discussion about, what both of us considered as an established fact, that physical entities do not have standalone existence. They are relative to measurement. They're relative to one another. There's nothing absolute that we see there. And what that meant, and I said, well, to me, what that means is that there is something else that is not physical and is absolute, and therefore grounds the relations of that constitute physical things. Like movement is a relation, but you need to have things that move in order to speak of movement. Movement without things that move mean nothing. So my position was, we need then the things that move. We need absolutes that are then not physical. The position of this physicist was that, well, whatever is there underlying this whole thing, why can't we just call it physical? And I think, and this is not a malicious point. This is sincere, because in the minds of these people, whatever exists is by definition physical. And if nature, through the replies that nature give our experiments, tell us that all of the properties of physicality that we have in our minds, that all of that is not the ground of reality, then the meaning of the word just follows nature. In other words, physical is the name we give to whatever exists, whatever it is. Even if it's mental, we will wrap an overdetermining equation around it, and we will say that it's physical. Now, the reason it may not work is that people like us are already publicly screaming, saying they will try to do this. They will make physicalism true merely by language redefinition. So even if it turns out the world is not amenable to physical description, that the world as it is in itself is composed of states that have no meters, have no kilograms, have no hertz, no coulombs, no joules, nothing. It's purely qualitative, they will still say, well, that's just the next level of the physical. And they will wrap an equation around it that's vastly overdetermining, and that will be it. In other words, even when reality turns out to be the very opposite of what we colloquially refer to as physical, they will still try to use the term physical, not because it's a conspiracy, not because they're malicious, but because physicists study the fundamental nature of reality, right? So it ought to be physical because they're physicists. You see? But this will only be avoided if we scream as hard as we can in the prediction that they will try to do this. And then when the time comes and they do try to do this, it will be like that audience yesterday in India who had a laugh at the Russian Minister of Foreign Affairs. The Russian Minister of Foreign Affairs yesterday in India said, we are trying to stop a war that the Ukrainians started. And then the audience just started laughing uncontrollably. If we anticipate this move by physicalism strongly enough, when they try to do that, the audience would just collapse in laughter. And that's what we have to make sure will happen. Physicalism is a dead man walking. It's on life support. Not even that. It's dead. It's a matter of time. But we cannot allow it to resurrect itself by mere linguistic redefinition.
And this one's gonna get you going, because you have people who, I do watch Sean Carroll for certain things, but he does make claims often where he's like, afterlife is impossible, physicalism is true, the multiverse is certain. I'm like, okay, so touch on those three. I don't know. You can get him going here.
We live in a culture that, because it believes so unconditionally in physicalism, it has legitimized complete lunacy and woo-woo, if that's the price to validate belief in physicalism. It has become a form of religion in the bad sense. I think to characterize anything as a form of religion is a great thing to say about anything, but in this case, I mean it in a bad sense. It has become an article of belief. So the multiverse hypothesis, here's what it tries to do. When we make individual quantum measurements, sometimes the results of those observations sort of discombobulate us because they defy physicalist expectations, like that quantum entanglement experiment with Alice and Bob that I described earlier.
From
That
Delft?
result sort of
The Delft one?
It was also done in Delft in 2015, but in other places as well. So that's a sort of a discombobulating result for physicalism, because it's not what they expected. They expected that measurement would simply reveal pre-existing physical properties and not determine those properties. So the idea of the multiverse does the following. Whatever you actually measure in single measurement results, even if it is discombobulating and contradictory and it's not what you were expecting, it doesn't matter, because the results you would expect do happen, but in other parallel universes in which other copies of you see those results. So there's no reason to fret about anything. Whatever your favorite belief about the essence of reality is, you can hold on to it, because even if the evidence seems to contradict it, well, in some other parallel universe, it doesn't. The only thing that you have to hold on to is laws of large numbers. In other words, the statistical averages of these results. But individual measurements, you don't need to fret if it contradicts your favorite prejudice, because in another inaccessible universe, in another inaccessible dimension, an inaccessible copy of you will be observing that inaccessible result. The operational word here being, the operative word being inaccessible. And now, what does this mean? What this means is literally unimaginable. It means that every time there is a microscopic level interaction in nature, anywhere in the universe, a whole new parallel universe for which we have precisely zero empirical evidence pops into existence. Now, how many microscopic interactions in the whole of the universe are happening every infinitesimal fraction of a second? You cannot wrap your head around that. It's impossible to imagine. It makes the Big Bang looks like how do they call that? Snap bang, that firework for kids wrapped in white paper.
Firecrackers.
No, not a firecracker. You just throw it on the
Yeah,
ground.
I know, like the snappers or something. I forgot the
snappers.
name, but I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah, it makes the Big Bang look like a little child's snapper, because the amount of empirically inaccessible, unverifiable stuff that is supposed to be coming into existence out of nothing, every infinitesimal fraction of a second, is literally unimaginable. This is the most inflationary hypothesis that can be coherently conceived by the human intellect. Nothing can possibly beat it. And we have precisely zero evidence for all these unimaginable quantities of unverifiable stuff popping into existence. I mean, countless universes have come into existence after we started talking about it. Countless. You cannot wrap your head around it. And we have precisely zero empirical evidence for it. Now, if this isn't an article of pure and arbitrary religious faith, I don't know what is. All the myths of Christianity, even if interpreted literally, are a lot more amenable to reason than this. This is just wacko, crazy, far out stuff. This is deserving of a large psychological study. How otherwise intelligent and reasonable people can defend lunacy like this in order to preserve a prejudice about what reality should be, despite what nature is telling us it is.
You know, the next one that would probably work well with this would be fine tuning. That's a big one.
That's a more difficult one.
Yes, and I know you had an article, was it something about black holes? If I have nothing else more to say, it was black holes or something like this?
I found a better alternative now.
Okay.
The fine-tuning of the universal constants is a vexing question for materialists and idealists alike. Analytic idealists are naturalists, they are reductionists, and they are realists, just like the materialists. In other words, analytic idealists believe that there is a real objective world out there. It is natural and not the result of some premeditated plan by a dictator divinity. And there is only one thing we can reduce everything else to. We just differ in what that thing is. For materialists, it's 17 quantum fields. For idealists, it's one subjective field of mentation. Other than that, we are all naturalists, all reductionists, and all realists. So for both these camps, the fine-tuning of the universal constants is discombobulating, because at first sight, it seems to require a premeditated agency to have deliberately designed and created this universe, for there to be complexity in it. I don't want, this doesn't fit my sense of philosophical aesthetics. And I'm putting it in these words because I want to acknowledge directly that it's a form of prejudice. Who am I to know whether there isn't a creator divinity out there? Now, if there is fine-tuning, it is discombobulating enough to validate at least a conversation about that. But I personally don't like the idea. It doesn't fit my sense of aesthetics. It would create all kinds of ethical problems that I rather not deal with. So I have the prejudice of preferring to find a way to rescue naturalism from this established observation. And one way that I had originally found was the evolutionary idea of the universes. And the idea is what looks from the inside as a universe looks from the other side as a black hole. In other words, every black hole we see around us is actually the other side of a universe. And therefore, black holes can only exist within universes where there is complexity. We know that because for there to be a black hole, there has to be first matter. In other words, there has to be a break in the homogeneity of energy distribution across space-time. There has to be an asymmetry that allows matter to clump up into these little clumps we call matter. And for those clumps to then clump up together to form what originally would be a planet, and to continue to clump up until the gravity becomes strong enough that turns into a star. And that star starts pulling more stuff into it until it becomes large enough that it collapses into a black hole. In other words, you have to have enough complexity for the laws of physics to exist in a universe that produces black holes. And on the other side of those black holes, there are other universes. So what you get is that it's only the universes in which the universal constants happen to be such that they allow for complexity and therefore new black holes to arise. Only those universes survive, because the ones in which the constants are not fine-tuned do not give rise to complexity, and therefore they do not give rise to black holes, and therefore those constants don't survive, are not passed along. You see what I mean? So you apply to universes the same evolution by natural selection idea that we apply to life. And that is a slightly satisfying intellectual way to wrap one's heads around it, around the fine-tuning, although I acknowledge it is entirely speculative. We have no idea what's on the other side of the black hole. And even if it were really another universe, how did the first black hole pop to get the whole process started? How did that complexity arise? And then you need parallel universes, and then you get all into that fantasy that shouldn't be physics, because physics should always be guided by empirical evidence, not by imaginative speculation. But recently, I was talking to a physicist called Marcus Miller, who has been leading an effort that I think will become mainstream in physics decades from now, not centuries. And his idea is the following. He's very aligned with analytic idealism in the sense that, in his view, physics doesn't make any statements about reality as it is in itself. It's beyond the reach of physics to make statements about reality. What physics does, and this is profound empiricism right here, what physics does is to predict what we will see next. And that's it. Everything else is philosophical conjecture and speculation. What physics does, and it's the only thing that can be falsified or not by experiment, is to predict what we will see next. Now, what that is in the sense of its inner essence, its being, no statements are made about that. No statements are made about whether what we see next is the real world. No statements are made about that. It only predicts, if I carry out this experiment, this is what I should see next. That's it. It's the most purely scientific formulation of physics you can have. Everything else has philosophy in it. Now, if that's the case, then the physical world we see is a construct, because the idea is that our own minds are theory-making engines. It serves evolution, it serves our ability to survive, to create models of the world, to predict what we will see next. Because if we predict we will see a tiger next, we run away. If we predict we'll see a river next, we can drink and survive. So the physical world of perception is a construction based on this attempt to anticipate what we will see next. The physical world is not an objective reality out there. It's self-constructed. And Marcus can even show that different people will necessarily construct similar physical worlds based purely on this attempt to refine your notion of what you will see next. Because when you make a wrong prediction, you have to correct it. When you make a right prediction, you reinforce that. And it's this game of reinforcement, or the model refining that we play will be such that you can show mathematically that it will converge to more or less the same place for different people. And therefore, we think we inhabit the same physical world, even though the world is not necessarily physical at all. It's a fantastic idea. And I think it's right, by the way. I will go public and say, I think it is correct. But what it means is that if the physical world is not reality, but a constructed model of reality, the agent that constructs it will always construct it in such a way that it can account for its own existence in it. It's obvious. right? If I am an agent and I'm constructing a model of the world that I call the physical universe, I will construct it in such a way that my existence within it can be accounted for and not contradicted by my own model, because that would be an internal contradiction. Therefore, the fine-tuning. We will always construct a fine-tuned physical universes because that's the only way to account for the existence of complex entities, complex agencies and observers like we are. And that will happen automatically. It's not like we will go in and surreptitiously define the gravitational constant as this or that other constant as that. No, no, no. We will construct a model in which there are planets and stars and nebulae and moons and volcanoes and rivers and storms and all that. But when we zoom in to those models, it will turn out that the universal constants are fine-tuned because we've constructed something that has complexity in it. Otherwise, we couldn't account for ourselves. So the fine-tuning is a self-creation. It's a creation of our own model. And the model is what we see. And what we see is what we colloquially call the physical world. And we can do all this being completely metaphysics neutral. In other words, this is the purest, most rigorous incarnation of scientific thinking that you can possibly have. You cannot beat this. This is science with zero philosophy, zero metaphysics, zero prejudice, zero even common sense. It's pure rigor. Pure rigor. And that's now my favorite account for the fine-tuning, even though the creators of this idea just described were not motivated by the fine-tuning. As a matter of fact, I was with Marcus Miller in the car the other day, and I confronted him with this again. And then he said, I haven't think this through yet. So it was not the original motivation, but I think it's one of the powerful things that that idea can do. It can account for the one most disconcerting, vexing empirical observation we have as naturalists. If you're not a naturalist, then you probably are not vexed by it anyway. But for a naturalist like me, I need a naturalist handle on it. And this idea in physics, I think, is the most promising handle we have.
A couple more questions. I was just wondering if we could do a quick bio break.
Sure, I'll refill my bottle.
Yeah, get
and
to feel
I'll be back in a minute.
Yeah, sure. You guys go ahead. I'll just monologue for a moment here. Keep the audience entertained. So, yeah, I got to say, this has been a really interesting conversation. Really thankful for both Kyle and Bernardo to come on here. And I really like what Bernardo was just saying about how we should look at it as just a way to predict what will happen next. And this is something I've been a big fan of myself for a while, actually. Those like McTaggart have talked about this. I can't give you an exact citation of when he said this, but I believe those like McTaggart have said this as well back in the early 20th century, that really all science is in the business of is just you look at your experiences, particularly your sense experiences, and you say, okay, you describe them. Here's what I'm observing. Here's what I'm experiencing. And then you just sort of piece together based on what you're experiencing. Well, here's what I will probably experience in the near future. So, or perhaps even in the distant future, whatever. And that's what science is in the business of. And even those like George Berkeley have said before that like scientists should consider signs rather than causes. That when you're looking at data in science and you're doing your research there, you're not looking at the absolute nature of reality. You're just looking at signs, signposts, things that point you in certain directions. And these signs could be accurate. They could be inaccurate. We're not entirely sure. You know, there's a lot that we're still piecing together. We can't see it all. So, yeah, I think even the, idealists such as George Berkeley goes far back and say very similar things. So this is an attitude that idealists have had for some time. Now, when it comes to what was another thing that he was saying there? Darn, it just eluded me. But it had to do with something about science, but it may come back to me in a moment. But either way, I do appreciate oh, hey, Mero's back. What's up? I was just noting the audience.
Feel better.
Excellent. Right on. Good. I was just noting the audience, how I appreciate what you were saying about, or you were citing somebody else saying that what science is really in the business of is just predicting what we're going to experience next. And so I was just also noting how there's even idealists in the past who've said, if not the same thing, very similar things. So that's actually right in line with the idealist tradition to sort of to see science in its proper role, to not elevate it too highly, to of course respect it, utilize it and everything, but to realize that it's only in the business of doing this and that. It makes predictions, it's useful, but this isn't the end all be all. So
Yeah, if you predict what you will see next, even if you have to use convenient fictions for it, like the invisible force of gravity, that was Newton's convenient fiction. Einstein's was the invisible but irreducible fabric of space-time that can bend and twist, replaced Newton's fiction. Now we have a new convenient fiction from loop quantum gravity, in which time itself is not fundamental, but arises from microscopic level quantum processes. Even if you're using just convenient fictions to predict what you will see next, as long as you do predict what you see next correctly, you still can develop technology.
Yeah.
You can still develop buildings and vaccines and computers and the internet and gene therapy and surgery. I mean, this only that is in fact a very big only that. You know what I mean? It's the most important only that for practical reasons, which is to predict what we will see next. If you can do that accurately, you can improve human life tremendously, but you will not be doing any philosophy whatsoever. And it's precisely this seeming limitation of the scientific method that gives it its strength. It's precisely by not being generally applicable to every question conceived by humans. It's precisely for that reason that it's not distorted and infused with subjectivity and prejudice and bias. This limitation is actually its strength. It's what keeps it sharp, objective, and reliable. Because if we were to expand the scope of science to deal with profound philosophical questions like ontology and ethics, we would be doing science a disservice, because we would be injecting prejudice and bias and all kinds of psychological figments into it that would weaken its power in the things that it can do very well.
absolutely, I couldn't agree more. This helps us clearly distinguish between science and pseudoscience. So I think having this very narrow understanding of what can really qualify as science makes it all the more rigorous, and I think that's just all the more beneficial. So I'm right there with you. Did you have any more questions, Kyle?
Yeah, there's a couple more. There's actually an argument I developed. I'm totally fine with this being shot down immediately. I just
It's okay.
I tried my best to see where we could push extremes to. It's a gaps in time, anesthesia and cryonics argument against idealism. But you can pick out a premise and then it falls apart. So here we go. Okay, so when we undergo a general anesthetic, we have a presumed gap in time and experience, yet metabolism is still occurring, meaning dissociation has not ended, but we seem to have no memory of the experiences. In the case of cryonics, one dies and has their body frozen until it is presumably brought back to life at a later date. Let's assume there's a gap in memory, time, experience, like anesthesia. Now, under analytic idealism, in the case of cryonics, dissociation ends and reintegration occurs at death. Upon resuscitation from cryonics, dissociation returns. There's no memory of what occurred when returned to life. This is due to the obfuscation caused by dissociation from the resuscitation process. So hopefully everyone followed me from that. Now, in the anesthesia problem, there is an absence of memory, yet dissociation is present. In the cryonics problem, we have the end of dissociation, yet appear again in the future time, again with no memory. Time in both cases carries on without our knowing. Now, it is said that the gaps are experienced by a transpersonal mind, not my mind alone, not yours alone, but a universal mind. Yet if we have that universal mind, why is there a gap of experience? So in the case of cryonics, it cannot be due to dissociation, as anesthesia doesn't end dissociation. It cannot be due to time, as a universal mind has time within it, time. So it must be that anesthesia increases brain noise, which is an image in consciousness. It therefore increases obfuscation. It would then seem anesthesia obfuscates our memory, not that it removes consciousness as it is present under anesthesia. I have a link for Gerald Bourlet, his He even says this on the Ascension Foundation, so thank you. In the case of chronics, this reintegration at death followed by dissociation and resuscitation, we wouldn't have access to the obfuscation memories due to dissociation. So, to clarify, anesthesia increased obfuscation is keeping from remembering. Upon reintegration, you remember. Chronics dissociation is keeping from remembering. Upon reintegration, you remember. So the problem is, what is it that experiences survives our death? Will we ever know it, or will it be under the gap like anesthesia? As the ability to know what is experiencing entails some form of metacognition that is presumably absent in the two problems above.
Okay, it's a long question.
Yes, sorry.
I'll probably say things that the questioner already knows, so he'll be thinking, why is he repeating that? I already acknowledged this in the question, but just for clarity. There is an answer to the question embedded in the question, and that answer is not that experience was missing, but that we cannot recall the experience during general anesthesia. There is also a big assumption in the question, which is that you can be in cryonics, you can come back to life after having been frozen and your metabolism paused. We don't know that. No human being has come back from life after being frozen for quite a while. We know that some frogs can come back to life after being frozen, but their metabolism doesn't really stop. They go into a kind of very, very deep state of hibernation. And their body fluids are such that the crystal forming that you get when you're frozen doesn't perforate cell membranes, but we don't have that body chemistry. So you would get damage from being frozen. So cryonics, I prefer not to speak about it because at this point, it's totally speculative whether people really can survive it and what they will remember, if anything. But anesthesia is something much more concrete. It's happening thousands of times a day. And Dr. Vourlet, in that conversation we had that is on the Anesthesia Foundation website, and even the article he wrote, he acknowledges, well, not even something to be acknowledged. He just reports on the fact that anesthesia is a cocktail of drugs. Some of those drugs are to render you immobile, so you do not have spontaneous movements or muscle spasms during surgery, which could lead the scalpel to cut something it's not meant to cut. So there is a drug there to stop you from moving. There is a drug there to stop you from being conscious of what's happening. And that's a dissociative drug, usually. It's brain noise. And there is a third drug to prevent the formation of memory pathways. So that you do not remember your experiential state during anesthesia is by construction. Anesthesia is made so that you don't remember whatever you might be experiencing. Now, fear not, you're not experiencing the pain of a scalpel, cutting into your flesh, because if you were experiencing that and just not remember it after you woke up, if you were having that experience, your heart rate would increase, your blood pressure would increase, there would be all kinds of physiological signs that you're in discomfort, and they would stop the surgery. So they are monitoring you at all times. Whatever you experience during general anesthesia, it's not pain. But whatever it is, you will also not remember because the cocktail of drugs is made so that you don't remember. They don't know exactly how it works, but they know empirically that certain drugs have this effect, and they use it to erase whatever you may be experiencing during that gap in anesthesia. So from an analytic idealism perspective, that's all you need. There is an experiential state, but the one that you don't remember. Having said that, the question raises a deeper issue, which is the nature of time. And the key assumption that the questioner seems to have is that time is objective, linear, and the same for everybody, the same for all observers. Physics has not really answered the question of time. We have a convenient fiction for time as a dimension that can only be traversed in one direction and never in the other. and you can accelerate or decelerate your traversion of that dimension. It's not the same for everybody, but it still obeys certain patterns encoded in general relativity. But this is a convenient fiction. And now we even know that it's not really convenient anymore, because loop quantum gravity and other attempts at grand unification theories, what they have in common is that they have to reduce time. If you don't reduce time, you can't reconcile quantum field theory with general relativity, because the difficulty of the reconciliation is precisely time. So to reconcile that, you are probably, I mean, there are options. There are people like Lee Smolin and others saying, actually, if you reduce space to time, then you can get away with it, and time being the only absolute dimension. But the mainstream now seems to be a fair degree of consensus that whatever time is, it's reducible. And if that is so, then the nature of time is an open question. And then you have to start asking yourself, is my arrow of time as the patient who has undergone anesthesia and thus has a gap in my timeline, is my time the same as the timeline of the neurosurgeon? Is it the same as the time of the nurse? Is it the same as the time of my partner who is waiting in the waiting room in the hospital? And that's an issue that has been brought up by Professor Bernard Carr from Queen Mary University, London, in which he suggests that the only way to account for a number of experiential states is to understand time, in fact, as multidimensional. And there is promise to that, because one of the least intuitive features of analytic idealism is that although our individual minds, in terms of their contents, are different, the subjectivity underlying every mind is the same. Like Schopenhauer said, it's the same one eye of the world that looks out from every creature. And although your thoughts and your emotions and your memories are different from mine, the experiencer of those thoughts, memories, and emotions is the same as the experiencer of my thoughts, my memories, and my emotions. And this is difficult for people to wrap their heads around. One way to try to make intuitive sense of that is to say, I am you in a different timeline. You can play chess against yourself. You can play a move with white, then stand up, go to the other side of the table, sit in another chair, and play a move against black. And then you stand up, go to the other side, and play another move against white. Now, if you could do this in a way that you can cut up your memories and then sew them together, such that you only have one chain in which you only played the black moves and another chain in which you only played the white moves, then you would think that there were two players. If you could interrupt your memories and cut and paste your memories in such a way that it creates separate but internally consistent timelines, you would think that the other person is another person indeed. In fact, while in fact it may be you in a different timeline interacting with yourself across timelines in some way. So this is all highly speculative, and idealism does not depend on any of this being true. But the problem that motivates these speculations is real, which is the fact that we know quantum field theory works to many decimal points, and we know general relativity works to many decimal points, and they are irreconcilable unless you reduce time. So you have to do something about that. And if that door is open, then you cannot really extract any definitive conclusion from the fact that there seems to be no elapsed time from the moment they give you anesthesia to the moment you wake up. They seem to follow one another, as if whatever was in between was cut and pasted, cut out, and the two ends pasted together, because this may be exactly what's going on. And that doesn't mean that there is missing time. It just means that you are, because of this cut and paste process, you are dissociated from a segment of a timeline. And therefore, because the two ends that remained were pasted together, you think that no time has elapsed. So it's more than just not remembering, it's having the conviction that no time has elapsed. And lo and behold, this may be exactly what happened. No time may have elapsed from the point of view of this particular dissociated process that you consider yourself. And the experience that was had in that period of time that was cut out and the two ends pasted together, that experience is there in the mind of nature, but you're dissociated from it because it was cut away from your timeline and the two ends pasted together. So this is all speculation, but the question invited speculation the moment it presupposed a classical view of time. And whatever the correct view of time is, we don't know yet, but we know one thing, the classical view of time is not correct. So there is no point in presupposing it in the question. But then again, even if it were correct, idealism would still accommodate and make sense of all this based on the notion that the lack of experience is one thing, the lack of the memory of the experience is another thing. So experience can be there, although it's not remembered.
This is interesting because if you run with it, and a couple other people have brought this up, and I remember hearing it late at night, you think about things. Does it end up to be some sort of cosmic solipsism then? Because if it's all you, oh yeah?
Yeah, but I have a friend who says this. We should not get lost in words and make too much out of just word convention. The word solipsism historically has meant that the view that the entire reality is your personal dream. So if I were a solipsist, I would think everything I'm seeing, including you, are figments of Bernardo Kastrup's imagination. That's what solipsism has historically meant. This is not what idealism says. Idealism says there is Kyle, he's over there and he has his own experiences. It's just that they are dissociated from my experiences as Bernardo. So it's not like everything is Bernardo's dream. It's just that everything is mental, but not Bernardo's mentation alone. But if you define cosmic solipsism as the dream of that one field of subjectivity, the dream of core subjectivity, in other words, not the dream of egos, not the dream of people, but the dream of the one underlying layer of reality, which is a field of subjectivity, then it's valid. You can define cosmic solipsism that way, in which case it would be synonymous with analytic idealism. The only problem is that it would be particularly prone to misinterpretation. Given the historical use of the word solipsism, it would invite misunderstanding. So I don't think it's useful to do that. I prefer an analytic idealism. But in your heart of hearts, if you're not communicating to anyone and you want to regard this as cosmic solipsism, it's valid. Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't mean anything negative by it. It's interesting because one of the things that people get stuck on is that this I-ness, and if you want to unpack something real quick with a thought experiment, it's just the memory self versus POV self, right? So if I were to upload you to a cloud and like, you're up there, you're still sitting here, you're like, what are you talking about? You have a differentiation of that felt sense of I and that core I-ness, or the first person core subjectivity, as you call it. That POV self is the universal mind, right? That's the field of subjectivity. That's the
POV in the sense of point of view. Point of views vary, so I wouldn't characterize it as the POV self. I would just say core subjectivity, because point of views are distinguishable. You have one point of view, I have another.
Yeah, but I mean, that's hang on. When you get so just no POV, but you have that felt sense of I-ness, that stuff that remains when you upload your mind or whatever to the cloud, that remains. That's the universal consciousness. That's the everything unfolding within, right?
Yeah,
That's the I.
It's what would remain if you suddenly became completely amnesic in a perfect sensory deprivation chamber. That would remain. And that would be the same for everybody. Before you have your particular thoughts, your particular opinions, your particular memories, your particular perceptions, before you have any of that, you're just subjectivity. And at that level, you're identical to me, not only because you're an identical copy of me, no, but because you really are one with me. It's the same subjectivity. One exercise to try to understand this, I propose it in Why Materialism is Baloney. You have two eyes, and each eye actually sees a different image. each eye has a slightly different point of view. That's why we can see depth, because the eyes, each of your eyes does not see the same thing. But if you take an object, say my phone, and I put it here, then, and I close one eye and I look with the other, the two images are almost the same. Not quite, but they're almost the same. But as I keep coming closer, each eye sees a completely different view, to the point that at this level, my left eye does not see the camera and my right eye does. So here you have one mind with two different points of view. And yes, we reconcile these 2 points of view, but fundamentally, it illustrates what I'm trying to express. You can have one mind, one subjectivity, experiencing 2 different points of view simultaneously. In other words, your point of view and my point of view, although it's only one mind. Where is the difference? The difference is that when I'm looking at my phone, I remember both points of view. I can access both of them. But in the case of you and me, we are, that word comes back, we are dissociated. The 2 points of views, unlike the points of views of your eyes, they become dissociated. In every other way, they're identical to the different points of view of your eyes. It's just that when you're looking from one eye, you don't remember looking from the other. That's all there is to it. That's what dissociation is. So you see, it's not as fundamental a leap as people think. We can now easily understand and easily experience what it is like to be one mind having multiple different points of view. It isn't difficult. You actually, every time you open your eyes, that's exactly what you're experiencing. One mind, 2 different points of view. But in your case, they're cognitively associated. You can access both of them and remember it. In the case of you and me, we are 2 eyes of the mind of nature, but we are dissociated. We cannot cognitively access the other point of view, just like you can't when you close one eye, or when you invert and you close the other eye. So it's not as difficult to see and imagine as people think at first.
Because there is a misunderstanding that has popped up online for a reverse interpretation of the position. So this is what happens. Excuse the drawing, but so we'll do one, and we'll have, so there's like you, me, other people, and our consciousnesses go up, and that field arises like an emergent physicalist interpretation, right? To your mind, that consciousness is the same. It's all the same. If I die, my consciousness continues because that consciousness is there. But that's not what you mean. You mean the opposite way. So if you flip it upside down, that core is you, and these are just the characters you kind of play. It's
Correct.
a complete opposite, but people mix that up. They'll say, okay, well, consciousness is still there after I die because I identified it with it, but it's subtle. It's the other way around. It's the one thing, and you fall back into it kind of, and is a way to
yeah. The mind of nature is not an amalgamation of separate individual minds.
Yes, that's it.
Beautiful. It is the thing that expresses itself as separate individual minds. It's the underlying reality. It's the fundamental level. Individual minds are dissociative processes running in that mind of nature. So the mind of nature is not an amalgamation. It's not a combination. It's not a compound result of individual minds. It's that which underlies every single individual mind.
We have just a handful left. Are you still good for a little bit, Bernardo?
Yeah, if there's only a handful left, we can, let's do the following. I will answer the questions that are already there right now. I will not answer new questions that pop from this point on. Is that okay?
1 second.
Sure.
Okay, so there's 4. Okay, after that, that's done. Okay. Actually, this is a good one. So after we talked about humming, do you have anything to put, Emma? I gotta unpack this one a little bit before I bring it to Bernardo.
What do you mean? Like, is there any like questions I have for him, or?
Yeah, I just have to unpack one of these questions a little bit before I give it to him.
Oh, that's okay. Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Well, I guess one quick comment I'll say. Bernard, are you familiar with the term the internal relatedness of all things, or everything is internally related?
No.
Oh, okay, that's fine. I won't delve too far into it or anything like that. It's one idea that in the 19th century, Hegelian neo-Hegelians used that argument for a kind of monism that said, well, since everything is related to each other, everything is in a sense networked together. So there's this one network, this one system that everything is all connected to. There's like one relator in a sense. And so they would say perhaps that's the fundamental mind, the fundamental self, and that's what everything ultimately relates to. And so I was just wondering if you had like any comments on that. But I know Kyle's going to be getting to another question here for you.
Well, it probably has more depth. The people who said this probably meant something that I'm not picking up. But if I just take it in face value, this relatedness holds under analytic idealism for sure, but holds under physicalism as well, holds under physics because of entanglement and Big Bang theory put together. Nature is an integrated whole,
Yeah.
causally, even under materialism. So it doesn't seem to be a postulate that would distinguish metaphysical options, at least not the interesting metaphysical options.
You're absolutely right. Yeah, it's a good argument for like a monism. So you're right. Jonathan Schaffer, who's a physicalist, he wrote an article recently called "The Internal Relatedness of All Things." It's not recently, I guess, but
Okay,
yeah.
no, Schaffer, that's different. Because beyond relatedness, what is proposed there is that the only member of the reduction base is the whole. It's a kind of holism, not only monism. In other words, it reverses reductionism. You have to reduce things upwards to the whole, as opposed to downwards to the parts. Jonathan Schaffer his argument is that the universe has no proper parts. There is only the whole. And that the behavior of nothing can be described in isolation from the behavior of everything else. So this is not only an expression of interrelatedness, it makes a much more demanding claim on top of relatedness, which is you can only, between quotes, reduce things to the whole, and that there are no proper parts to the universe. If you look deeply enough into all the causal chains, you realize that the only part is the whole. There are no proper subparts.
Interesting. Maybe I misunderstood Schaffer. I thought he would say there are proper parts, but that the whole is prior to the parts. But you know what? Maybe I need to go back and
Well,
reread Schaffer.
yeah, you may be right, but that would be then a fine semantic point. To say that the whole is prior to the parts is to say that the parts can only be reduced to the whole. So yeah, meaning-wise, between us, it's the same thing. But in terms of the particular semantic usage and the rigor that goes with it, you may be right.
Okay. Well, thank you for your answer on that one. Kyle, you said you were trying to unpack something here?
Yeah, it's a bit of a late question, sorry, whoever had it, but it's actually about the dream metaphor you have about waking up. I think the Anesthesia Cryonics thing brought up a bit of an issue with knowing. So they said the problem arose from the claim that death would be like waking up from a dream, or it was something like the dream metaphor. But where's the reflective bit if universal mind is not metaconscious? I think we touched on that, but that's something a little different. That's yeah.
Well, we can only reflect upon a dream on a mirror of memory. When you were dreaming, and that's a study published in 2007 by Jennifer Vint and a few others, they showed that our ability to metacognize is vastly reduced during the dream state. We become much more open to experience, to the ebb and flow of experience without thinking about the experience. But again, I can remember my dreams and I can reflect upon them, but I can only reflect upon them after I woke up from the dream and remember the dream. During the dream, I'm not reflecting unless you have a lucid dream. which is a rare state in which we can become self-reflective while still in the dream. And that's a fantastic state to be in. It happened to me several times. I don't call for it. I don't try to induce it. It just happens sometimes. And it's an amazing state. It's an amazing state because it allows you, once you become self-reflective, you can start investigating the dream like a scientist. So for instance, in my case, a question that I asked multiple times in lucid dreams was, okay, now that I know I'm dreaming, and I know this is just a dream, is the resolution lower than real reality? If real reality is 8K, is this just HD or SD? And I look around and no, it's really 8K. I can see every detail, every speck of dust. My mind somehow is generating the whole shebang. This is a very high resolution thing. And I ask other questions like, is this in any way more tenuous, more gaseous than real reality, less concrete? No, in no way. The only difference is that I can do stuff that I normally can't. Like I can lift my legs off the ground and not fall, like I'm sitting in an invisible chair. Other than these little tricks that you do to certify to certify to yourself that you are in a dream, it's the same thing, which proves the ability of mind to create worlds in very high definition, just like this right now.
Interesting. So when you do go back to the universal mind, you remember through the metaconsciousness stuff that you acquired through life. And
I think if you die, you no longer have the ability to generate metacognitive insights. And that's what I refer to when I say metacognition. What I mean is the capacity, the ability to generate metacognitive insights. But the metacognitive insights you had during life and which are remembered within your alter, yeah, they are seeded into a much broader cognitive context when you die. Because after you die, there is no dissociative boundary anymore. Your inner life is now part of the inner life of the whole of nature. So whatever cognitive insights you had, they are still part of nature. So in that sense, the mind of nature is becoming increasingly, quote, metacognitive in the sense that it is accumulating metacognitive goodies, but it doesn't have the capacity to generate these goodies itself, new goodies itself, other than through life. That's the point, you see?
This is good because this is the question. A lot of them are about death, so I think everyone's a little morbid and skeptic for some reason. Okay, so there's a suspicion that we are trying to identify with the cosmic mind is similar to what Bertrand Russell stated in regard to dealing with death. What is meant here is that an effective way of dealing with death is for the ego to identify itself with something larger than itself, aka the universe, so as to convince itself of some sort of survival. Otherwise, it's like saying, but that's not what you said here. So, and if it does, that's scary because you're living all the deaths and pig suffering. I think you had an interview too about that. So the next part I think is interesting because it's like an existential buffer, but that doesn't seem very comforting.
Do you want me to comment on this first part?
Sorry, yeah, the first part is it's like an existential, yeah.
I remember. My role is that of philosopher. I'm trying to communicate what I consider to be the best account of the nature of reality from the point of view of reason and evidence. And when I say evidence, I mean not anecdotal evidence, although that's interesting too. As a human being, I spend some time on those as well, but not the evidence I would use in my argument. I'm not trying to give people comfort or spiritual solace or ethical guidelines, although I think all of this can be even trivially derivable from the metaphysics I'm putting forward. But my hope is that people will derive it themselves and not need me to give them a recipe. So that's the role I'm trying to play, not give recipes about ethics or existential comfort, but bring people to a place where they can do that themselves, because it's much more authentic only then it's transformation. If you get it from me as a 7 steps to spiritual solace, yeah, you get it in your head, you will believe it, but it will not be transformational. You still suffer, you still have anxiety, you still have depression, all that shit, as I still have too. Even as the guy who embodies my own philosophy, it's not like anxiety and depression depression has disappeared off my life, but anxiety not. Depression is gone. Depression is a far away memory, but anxiety is not. So that's the role I try to play. So I'm not really directly trying to help people be happier or live in peace, but there are inescapable implications to the view of reality that I'm communicating that may lead to the disappearance of depression, to reinfusing your life with meaning to the point that it becomes saturated with meaning. What it will not do is get rid of your anxiety, death anxiety. That it will not do. Because that's what materialism could do in the mid-19th century. You know, the human species, its greatest fear throughout the 30,000 years in which we have developed the ability to self-reflect, its greatest fear was the fear of what we will experience after we are dead. In Christian mythology, that's the fear of hell. And that single fear has been used by totalitarian and authoritarian governments worldwide, across geographies, across history, to control people. Has been used by the church in Europe for 1,000 years and more to control people. You know, you could completely steer people's lives by threatening them with the fear of hell. So this was the single greatest fear our species has had for thousands of years. And in the mid-19th century, it's gone. That was such a psychological payoff. There's nothing to fear because you're not going to be there to experience. After you're dead, you're dead. And all of your guilt, all of your shame, all of your fear, they are all guaranteed to come to an end. Wow. No, we can't even relate to that anymore today because we take it for granted. We were born already having been granted this release. It's like you are on death row and somebody tells you will be pardoned right before. There will be nothing to fear. You're not going to suffer. And that analytic idealism brings back. Because, yeah, you will be there on the other side. It's not going to be Kyle or Bernardo. You're not going to go by that name, and your inner mentation will not be bound by the boundaries you experience now. But you will know it's you. Just like you know after you wake up, it was me in that dream avatar. You will know it in just as irresistible a way as you know when you wake up. And you will be experiencing something. And that something can be anything. Because without the protection of dissociative boundaries, God help you. You may get lucky and you find yourself in a maelstrom of positive feelings, or you may get unlucky and you may find yourself in a loop of depressive the words escaping now, but you get the feeling. So analytic idealism will not get rid of your anxiety completely, unless your anxiety is the fear of oblivion. If that's your fear, then relax. It's not going to happen. Even if you want it, even if God itself wants it, it will not happen. God cannot get rid of itself. What is cannot not be. So if that's your fear, relax. But if your fear is bad experiences, that's back. What analytic idealism can do very positively, it can get rid of your nihilism, your depression, your sense of meaninglessness, your lack of purpose, your notion that you're suffering for nothing. All of this dissolves away like butter under the sun, effortlessly, goes away effortlessly. But yeah, I hope you get there yourself and not me telling you this.
Yeah, and there's young people who've messaged me and said the same thing, that they had this kind of materialistic, nihilistic worldview, and then they came across idealism, and it's completely changed how they see things. So that's true.
The bad news comes later. The bad news about, you can have bad experiences, or that your life's not about you, that nature is expressing itself through you, and it doesn't have your well-being in mind. It has its own agenda. All that stuff comes later. But by that time, you are already mature enough within those shoes of analytic idealism, that you also have a different way to relate to it, a way that is conducive to peace. I'm in complete peace with everything I just told you, but there is a phase in which it's tough.
Yeah, because it seems to cut both ways. You could feel comfort that like your friends and loved ones are not lost, but God knows what they're experiencing, right? Good, bad, all the above. So yeah, it doesn't sound like an existential buffer. Maybe for oblivion, but second last question here is about an argument you had when you had a debate with Philip Goff about cosmopsychism and idealism. I'm going to shorten this one down a little bit. Hopefully it still gets the part, but it says there's confusion of how we understand consciousness in relation to the universe. When it is said that all is within consciousness, there's a misunderstanding that consciousness goes above and beyond the universe. However, there is just consciousness, meaning they're not two separate entities, but one, consciousness. The universe is conscious, the universe is what consciousness looks like from a disassociated boundary. This could be imagined two ways, both would be one thing. But what Goff was saying is that consciousness underlies the universe as you're explaining something in terms of another. So it's like when they say, okay, we have the universe and then we have God. Why do we need to have consciousness outside when it's all within? It's a subtle difference. I don't know if it was unpacked well enough, though.
Yeah, I understand you.
Yeah, okay.
It's largely linguistic, and there is no right or wrong here, so long as we understand what's meant. So if I say that all is in consciousness, and I am on record saying this, what I mean is the following. I am imagining consciousness as a field of potentiality and things as excitations of that field. Therefore, all things are in consciousness in the same sense that the excitation of the guitar string is in the guitar string. Excitations of something are in it in a certain way. Another way to say this, probably more rigorously correct, is to say that all things are consciousness in the sense that a vibrating guitar string is still the guitar string. It's a doing of the guitar string. So the being is the guitar string and things are doings. So in that sense, I could say all things are consciousness. So you see, I can say all things are in consciousness in one sense. And in a different sense, perhaps a better one, I can say all things are consciousness in the sense that there's nothing to them but consciousness in excitation, consciousness vibrating. What I cannot say is that all things are conscious, because now I'm saying consciousness is a property of things that have other properties unrelated to consciousness. And this is now a form of panpsychism. A form of panpsychism that says, okay, there is only matter, and matter has certain properties like mass, charge, spin, momentum, and experiential state. So consciousness becomes an add-on property to matter. And now I cannot say all things are in consciousness. No, consciousness contains nothing. Consciousness is a property of things that in turn contain it. I cannot say all things are consciousness. No, mass, charge, spin, momentum are not consciousness. Consciousness is an add-on. Now I can only say all things are conscious. And now this is no longer idealism. Now you are a particular form of panpsychist. This is one particular version of panpsychism. There is another version of panpsychism, and that's probably Phillips, that says the inner being of things is consciousness, and physical properties are the outward manifestation of the inner being. And then you can again say all things are consciousness. But now there is a difference, a major difference with idealism, because although you can still say all things are consciousness, in that consciousness is the inner being of everything, you are still saying the structure of consciousness is the structure of the physical world. In other words, consciousness is fundamentally divided up into subatomic particles occupying space-time loci. And idealism doesn't say that. Idealism says the structure of physicality is merely the structure of an appearance. It's not the structure of the thing that appears. The structure of physicality is the structure of the dashboard, not of the sky outside that is measured and whose measurements are presented on the dashboard. Under idealism, you cannot confuse the structure of the dashboard, i.e. the physical world, with the structure of the real world, i.e. the thing that is measured. But under that form of panpsychism that I'm talking about, they do exactly that. They take the structure of the dashboard and they say, this is the structure of the sky outside. But the inner being of the dashboard out there is consciousness. And then you get, what this ends up with is an amalgamation, a kind of Frankenstein monster of parts of materialism, which say the structure of reality is the structure of the physical world, and parts of idealism, which says the inner being of existence is consciousness. And you take these two parts, one from either side, and you arbitrarily merge them together, and you take these two parts because you want to somehow accommodate the current mainstream metaphysical worldview. Then you arbitrarily take a part from it to try to make something survive. Then you end up with that form, that incoherent form of panpsychism, in my view. And the psychology here is interesting. We like to think that we are on a kind of intellectual evolutionary path, that we are not making total mistakes, but that we are refining our model of the truth. And if that's your prejudice, then you would try your best to not see materialism as a total mistake. And I'm telling you, it's a total mistake. It's just bullshit. Bullshit. There's nothing to save and rescue from it. It's gone. Just throw it away.
Yeah.
But people who think, well, we are on an evolutionary path here, so they cannot say that materialism is all wrong. We just have to refine it. So what are we going to save out of it if we have to acknowledge that consciousness is the being of everything? What can we carry along with us to create this cozy, warm, fluffy feeling that we are evolving? Well, let's take that part of materialism that says the structure of consciousness is the structure of the material world. And why do we do that? Purely for psychological reasons. There is no reason and evidence behind this, no neutral rationality or empirical motivation to say this, other than the trivial one, which is, well, all I see is the dashboard. So the structure of the dashboard has to be the structure of reality. No, of course not. That goes back to the epistemic argument. It's not because all you see is the dashboard that the structure of the dashboard has to be the structure of everything. The limitations of your knowledge are not the ontic limitations of reality. And that same criticism can now be validly applied to that form of panpsychism. Anyway, I think I talked enough around it.
No, that was excellent.
Yeah, so it's funny that they accuse you of making a duality when you keep a monism, while they inherently make a dualism when they do the beginning of the question, at least.
They have to do that if they have this evolutionary perspective.
Yeah.
Like, we are never completely wrong. We just have to refine it. And that's a very, very dangerous perspective because it threatens to perpetuate bullshit.
Yeah, and they'll just what was it? One more thing about the gap. They'll say that consciousness one day will be explained like any other process, like winds, and all we're doing is idealism or consciousness of the gaps. And yeah, it was right back to the new Mysterian argument. Like,
what materialists do is the following. They all started, before the Renaissance, they all started like we all started, with a world of qualities around us, colors, flavors, scents, mental stuff, mental qualities. And then we discovered that we can describe this world through numbers. It's very helpful to describe this world through numbers. If I'm going to another village and somebody tells me it's 1 kilometer away, I will expect a different experience than I would have expected had this person told me it's 100 kilometers away. Or if I'm going to pick up a piece of luggage and I'm told it's 5 kilograms instead of 50, I will expect a different experience. So numbers are very good for describing qualities. But because of the schism with the church, scientists during the the Enlightenment, they had to carve out an ontological ground that was not under the domain of the church. The domain of the church was psyche. It's a Greek word that translates into mind, spirit, soul, all these things. They are all the same in Greek, psyche. So they had to carve out something that was not mental, not spiritual, not soul stuff, not church stuff. And they figured, oh, the quantities. Let's say that the quantities precedes the qualities described. It's like saying the map precedes the territory. And they knew this was bullshit. I mean, they needed Diderot's on record saying materialism doesn't work, but we need to keep using it as a weapon against the church until we have a better one. And that's Diderot, one of the authors of La Encyclopédie, the founding document of the Enlightenment. So they knew it back then. But at some point, we started drinking our own snake oil. And we started believing our own bullshit. So what materialists do is the following. They maintain that, yeah, right now, we can't reach into the map and pull the territory out of it. We cannot pull reality out of a description of reality. We cannot pull the qualities out of the quantities. But one day, somebody's going to do a second version or a third or a 10th version of this map. And then, yes, you will be able to reach into the map and pull Manhattan Island out of it, or The Hague, or Amsterdam. That's the promise. If you believe this, my advice to you is buy yourself a comfy chair and sit while you wait.
So here's the last one to wrap up. This is actually a shout out to a professor, John A. Leslie, who has wrote on idealism a lot too. He's at the University of Guelph. For argument's sake, let's say the multiverse is real. Analytic idealism would still seem to hold. Yet, as in the works of Professor John A. Leslie, it would seem that each universe is in itself a universal, or in his words, a divine mind. And we would have an infinite series of universal minds, as mentioned in his Infinite Minds work. So it would seem that this is, if this is so under analytic idealism, can't talk anymore, these universal minds are subjects of a higher mind that's unified. And he just wanted to get Bernardo's thoughts on that.
I don't have a beef against the hypothesis of parallel universes in principle. There are many different motivations to entertain that hypothesis. My beef is against one particular motivation, which is to make sense of experimental results regarding quantum entanglement without parting with, in physics, is called non-contextuality, which is a standalone existence of physical entities. So if that's your motivation, to postulate parallel universes popping up in infinite numbers at every infinitesimal fraction of a second, then I think you are a lunatic. You are drunk on metaphysical prejudice, so drunk that you don't even know how drunk you are. You don't even know you're drunk at all. And you're just entertaining lunacy. So that is not a motivation to entertain the hypothesis of parallel universes, and that's my beef. Now, if you drop that motivation and we are having a conversation late at night after a good dinner with a glass of wine, and you say, but there may still be parallel realms in the mind of nature, because what we see is a function of our own cognitive apparatus, which evolved to pick out the elements of reality that are relevant to our survival. And the result of that is what we colloquially call the physical world. But it stands to reason that whatever is out there in reality that is not salient for our ability to survive, our cognitive apparatus would not pick out. Why would it need to do so? And then you may want to call that a parallel universe. In other words, elements of reality that are fundamentally incommensurable with our own cockpit, with our own dashboard. Stuff that we don't measure, we don't bother to measure. It's really out there, but it's inaccessible to us. In other words, it's beyond the colloquially physical universe, what we perceive, even through instrumentation, because we still need to perceive the output of instrumentation. All the microscopes and telescopes and oscilloscopes, whatever, you still need to perceive the output of the instruments. So everything still gets filtered out through our cognitive system. And there may be things going on out there that we don't pick up, we don't pick out, we don't identify, that from our point of view, it is as though they didn't exist. Now, you can call this a parallel universe. Now, we can go further and you can say, well, dissociation is hierarchical. So we are dissociated within a higher segment of the mind of nature that is itself dissociated from even higher segments. So, and then you could say, well, the dissociated segment one step above us, which we go back to when we die, that is not the ultimate level. That is still a sub-level of the whole, dissociated from the other sub-levels. And you can call these sub-levels parallel universes. These are all fine avenues of speculation. From an experiential perspective under psychedelics, I give even more credence to it than I should give from a purely rational point of view. Because from a purely rational point of view, I would say there's nothing logically incoherent about this. There is nothing physically incoherent about this. But we don't have good reasons to entertain the hypothesis because we have never seen signs of this parallel stuff. If at the LHC they discover gravity leaking, now that would be a sign that there is other stuff going on. And only then should we start speculating about it. But until then, no. And yet I do, because experientially under psychedelics, once your dissociative boundary is really porous, things come in that you go and say, this is not from this universe. This is something else, and it's equally autonomous. It has a life of its own. It's very objective. It has internally consistent rules, even though rules different from what we have here, not only physical rules, but also logical rules, the rules in which contents of cognition are associated with one another can be different. In our universe, cognitive associations operate on the basis of similarity. Not literal similarity in terms of spatial similarity, but similarity of meaning, similarity of form, all kinds of similarities. That's how we associate things cognitively. That's how our logic works. And there are realms of mind, I suspect, in which associations unfold according to different rules. And you could call those parallel universes. I don't have a problem with any of these. I just think that we should be sober regarding how much we speculate about this, because if we spend our lives speculating about things that we do not have objective reasons to entertain, we will miss out on life. We will miss out on the things that are right here, right now. Nature is expressing itself to us in this universe, in this time. And it's very difficult to decipher. And we are God's spies. We are the only game in town to spy on this stuff and figure out what to make of it. But if we are busy with our own inner speculation about parallel universes and whatnot, we miss out on it. We become incompetent and lazy spies. So I wouldn't recommend this. Look, this universe right now is a gargantuan pit of mystery. And we haven't seen the bottom of it. It's enormous. It's filled with mystery to the brim, inside and outside. You do not need to fantasize about other mysteries that may or may not be the case. You are already immersed in a maelstrom of mystery with no end. If you just have the eyes to see it and not fall for the banality that our culture espouses today, like, oh, we figured it all out. We just need to sort out the details. No, we figured nothing out. We figured out how to build toys, how to develop technology. A 5-year-old kid can play a computer game and be world champion without understanding the game. That's technology for you. We know how to manipulate nature and be world champions without understanding nature. So the fact that we can put a man on the moon, change our genes, and create the internet, it doesn't mean that we solved the mystery at all. Not even 5% of it, let alone 80. So I wouldn't, I'm not here to share recipes, but for what it's worth, I will share with you this aspect of my own inner life. I am not looking for more mystery than I'm already obviously immersed in. It's already overwhelming enough.
Although if you do have any recipes to share, we are open.
Absolutely.
That's not me. No.
Indeed. Well, is that it for the questions, Kyle? Is there anything else you'd like to comment on or anything else you'd like to ask?
this is actually for me. It was just you mentioned what is it? I'm kind of on the death topic now from all the questions. We mentioned if there's another layer above, it's not the final layer where you die onto. Do you think you could keep some kind of like semblance of yourself on that next layer, like the Jungian ribosome? Um, so you
Well,
wake up.
you could argue that the Jungian rhizome is the whole mind of nature, and that there is no level in between. And if we leave this level of dissociation, we are back to oceanic consciousness, the consciousness of the whole. And that could be the rhizome. So the Jungian rhizome metaphor does not necessarily imply that there is a dissociative level between us and the mind of nature as a whole. It can be interpreted that way, but it's not necessary to do so. So the question you're asking is, could it be that when this level of dissociation we call life, that when this ends, we fall back into another intermediary level of dissociation
Yeah.
that is still dissociated from the whole? This is, analytically speaking, a coherent hypothesis. The question is, do we have enough reasons to entertain it seriously? And right now, I don't see enough reasons. There are anecdotal reasons. And for some, they may be enough. And then this is not a shame. It doesn't mean that they are poor thinkers. I know excellent, deep thinkers in the University of Virginia who take this hypothesis very, very seriously.
Yeah.
So I'm expressing just a difference of perspective from them, not a criticism of their perspective, just to put it clearly on the record. I personally don't spend much of my time entertaining the hypothesis of intermediary levels of dissociation between us and the mind of nature. Part of it can be wishful thinking. I'm not immune to it, but at least I'm aware of my own wishful thinking. I would prefer that there is no such intermediary level. Dissociation, although it's clearly something nature is pushing towards, so it serves some purpose. There is some telos, even if not a premeditated one, not a deliberate one, there is some felt instinctive telos in nature that pushes towards dissociation, because life pops up everywhere, the most unlikely places. So although there is certainly profound meaning to life, and there is a job to be done in life, I personally would prefer that when my job is done, I'm out of this dissociative game. But this is my ego speaking, and it's
I
my
don't
ego
blame
saying,
you.
I don't want to be an ego.
You
I
still
don't want to be an ego.
you still think you would feel like yourself though when you're at that complete disassociated state?
Of
Like,
course. You would look back and know it was you all along, of course.
so you're not losing anything.
Of course not. That's why I would prefer that.
Oh, so you literally mean it when you're playing a character, you're literally playing the character of Bernardo.
And I will remember having played the character Bernardo, but I don't want
That's
to step on stage again.
yeah, no.
I hope I do this play and this is it. But
And
of course, everybody else is the real me too. And everybody else will still be around. So ultimately, I'll still be playing like everybody else is playing, because everybody else is one thing. So I know how inconsistent with my own model it is to say that I hope I don't get into this mode again, because everybody else who will be in this mode is also me. But Bernardo prefers not to continue to exist as Bernardo. Yeah,
well,
that's my personal prejudice. Yeah.
come back at this round, you'll see how grateful I am for your time. So thank you.
Excellent. Okay. Anything else, gentlemen? Any last comments, thoughts, questions?
That's all the questions. That's it.
Okay. All right. Thanks again, Bernardo. You've been incredibly generous with your time, and you've been giving us some very valuable insights. So thanks again. And thanks to you, Kyle, as well.
I enjoyed it very much, you guys. I like when I'm asked probing questions. And it probably took a Dutch guy to do this, because in Dutch culture, we know it's not a problem to be critical and confrontational. It's okay.
Of course.
But I'm usually interviewed by people who think that they have to wear, velvet gloves and be super polite. And then I don't get asked the questions that would give me the chance to actually clarify some difficult things. So I'm saying all this to say that I'm thankful to you for the opportunity I got to clarify difficult things today.
Excellent. You're welcome. And I'm sure Kyle also would like to express that as well.
Yeah, what is it? Blijf streng op jezelf, eh?
Yeah.
That's
Thank you very
excellent.
much.
Okay. Well, take care,
Thanks,
everyone.
everybody.
Goodbye.
Take care.